All right. Hello, and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker. And today we have a special treat for the audience. So, in the first place, I'm joined by a guest who's a repeat guest, atheist David Johnson from Skeptics and Seekers. Hey, David.
How do?
How's everything going with you on Skeptics and Seekers?
Uh, Never better, never busier, never tougher because I just started a new 9 to 5. I have no time for anything, and yet I have a burning passion to keep doing shows and stay in this. It's just harder to do, but I feel like there are a lot of comments that happen online that I want to get back to and can't. So it's kind of the tug of war between doing what I want to do and doing what I have to do.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So I'm having to give a little bit more attention to what I have to do.
Yeah. It's always like that. I find for everyone. So, all right, cool. And yeah, and I know you just did a show with a great guest. I think you had his name Dale Glover on, right? No, sorry, Tyler Vela. Uh,
Yeah, no, we both are great guests. It was a great show. If you have not heard it, skepticsandseekers.squarespace.com. You can find it there, log in your Discuss account, discuss away. Tyler, I knew he was going to be a good guest because I've seen, videos with him on shows, and I like the way his brain works, even when I disagree with him. And I think that we both probably have that in common. We like, talking to people who think deeply about the things that they believe, and we're just that kind of nerd. And so Tyler really slotted in well between the two of us, not just in style, but also in belief. Wouldn't you say? I mean, there's you and me that kind of represents the extremes, and then Tyler, not really on either one of our our extremes. And so it's just the dynamic of the conversation I thought was really really good.
Awesome. All right, cool. Yeah. So today we're going to be talking about something, believe it or not, I've never done. I've never done on Real Seekers, and we never did on Skeptics and Seekers, which is kind of like what the heck's wrong with us as hosts, because this is something that's probably the most important thing for me. My 11 premise argument, or at least rough sketch of an argument as to why am I a Christian? Why do I believe Christianity is true? And this encapsulates all of my 8 to 10 years of religious research as a non-Christian, and how I ultimately came to faith in May of 2018. Now, one thing, I'll just kind of start off. In terms of my 11 premise argument, the stuff that's posted on my blog, obviously I do, that's just a rough sketch. I need to tweak it and improve it to make it a proper argument and stuff like that. But I think what's up there now does give you the main components and essence of how I did come to the truth of Christianity via this argument. So that's what me and David are going to be discussing, this kind of rough version, exposing all the premises in my argument. So that said, let me present and just share my screen.
And
And for
while you're doing that, I just want to say that for most of this conversation, I will be turned away from the camera and therefore to you viewers, but that's because my screen is over there. And in this conversation, I'm going to have to pay a lot of attention to what's on the screen. So it'll look a little funny. I'm not ignoring you, audience. It's the only way I can stay engaged with the conversation. So
so just so you know, that's all lies. He's just going to be ignoring you.
yeah, mostly that would be the case normally.
Okay. Right, cool. So yeah, the first thing to do, I just want to take you guys read through the 11 premises before we get to it, and at a certain after about half of them, I'll just turn to you, David, and just without explaining, let me know which ones do you take issue with, or which ones do you accept, if any. But okay, so premise one, God exists. Premise two, well, if God exists, then what I call these G outcomes, or God outcomes, exist. Just meaning he has goals, he has purposes for what he does. So this includes the maximum number of human beings possible achieving their ultimate purpose in creation, whatever that is. And that specific goal is what I call Go One. Um, Premise 3, God could achieve this goal of Go 1 by using divine revelation to reveal which particular set of religious beliefs, that should say, just to simplify it, which religion humans should follow in order to achieve that goal, as well as obviously providing the means by which humans can accomplish that purpose. Um, okay, so let's stop there. The first three premises, which ones can you get on board with, or versus you just totally disagree with?
Okay. So let me preface this by saying I've read the full 11 premises before, and the summary isn't it. I mean, the full write up is like 300 and something pages, right? It's something. It was the chapter, what Dale called a chapter on this. It's a book. Um, it's a very long work, and so even as we talk about this, and even as Dale discusses this, and we try to expand this out, I will say that you're still not getting all of it because you can't. And maybe one day Dale will use this as a part of a doctoral thesis, but or dissertation, I guess it would be at that work. But I just want to say that if I'm commenting on some of this and it seems like I'm maybe not square in the middle of something that was said, it's because I've seen even a more full version of this than we're going to be able to get to today.
Yeah.
So that said, it is obvious and you expect it. God exists. I guess I could get on board with it better if it was if God exists then kind of a statement, but just to jump out God exists, I can jump out and say no, he doesn't. So we're done at premise one.
Yeah.
And so I not looking for defeaters, we'll just kind of take that as charitably as possible. And then premise two really begins that kind of statement that I can better interact with. If God exists, then. Mm-hmm. And here, even though that's the kind of statement that I would like to see, I think more definition has to be done here, because once again, if God exists, then blank is just assuming that you know something about this God and what he would do. If God exists, then Rocky Road would be the only kind of ice cream. I could say that. So, what are the characteristics of this God that makes your then statement correspond with the if God exists statement? I think, some work has to be done there for definition,
Yeah, you know what? Because this is obviously an argument in standard form, and as David said, 300 pages. Believe it or not, that's just one chapter related to premise 11, and I've also written a 200-page chapter on the cosmological argument, which is just one chapter under premise 1. So this thing is going to be thousands of pages by the time I'm finished in order to warrant all of these premises. So you're right. It probably makes more sense if I go through the premises and explain it and then ask you, do you agree or disagree?
Well, I do agree with premise 3 in full.
Okay.
So
well, that's good then. Okay, good.
Nothing against that. But I mean, look, folks, this is what Dale just said is true about his work. The title of this book is like 30 pages long.
Yeah, well, so far in terms of writing, my goal with Real Seekers is eventually all my 11 premise argument is going to be all written out for free on the blog kind of thing. So far, I've only done the cosmological argument for premise 1. I've written a chapter on the shroud, which is premise 11 of the argument, and I'm halfway done the hiddenness of God argument, which is part of premise 1. So I've got a lot of work to do. Yeah. All right, cool. So
Go ahead, go through. So you can. It's okay to stop and get my thoughts on some of this. We might actually find some other premises that I agree with fully. Given say, given your former premises and given what I know that you think about those premises, if that's the case, then this, I might actually agree with some more of these premises. So,
Awesome. So premise 3, great. Okay, so check for that one. Premise 4, I already know you're going to have to agree with this because otherwise you're the hugest hypocrite on Skeptics and Seekers ever. But look,
I am anyway. So
well, this one you're not going to want to deny. Premise 4 is that there's a chaos problem in terms of divine revelation. Well, which one did God reveal? There's this confusion that exists on Earth.
Yep.
Enough said.
Good. Yeah. No. So I mean, yeah, we agree. We don't have to even go back over that one, though we will.
Okay, cool. So premise 5, if God chose to use divine revelation, and there is this divine revelation chaos problem, well, then God is obligated to provide a sufficient clarifying mechanism. It doesn't address what that is to address this problem.
Yeah, go ahead. We'll come back to that one.
Okay. Premise 6, what I call religion authenticating events or miracles, attesting either to the truth or at the very least the endorsement of God of that religion, is one example of a clarifying mechanism God could use to address the problem.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Mm-hmm. And just to simplify for basically, miracles are one way that one clarifying mechanism God can use to say this divine revelation, not the others.
Yeah, and we don't even have to agree on what a clarifying mechanism is. The premise isn't that specific. It's just saying that God would need to provide some kind of clarifying mechanism, and there's some possibilities of what those are.
Exactly. I'm providing one example. There can be other examples outside of these things. So cool. Now, premise 7. So if God has this outcome defined in premise 2, right? He wants as many humans as possible to achieve their ultimate purpose, whatever that is. And God chose to use divine revelation to clarify which religion he wants us to use. Then the prior probability of a religion authenticating event is equally probable for some events in certain circumstances. I'm going to imagine there's going to be some stuff to talk about there.
Yep. So we'll come back on that. Let's go ahead with premise 8 before there's a flow here. So go ahead.
Okay. Okay. So premise 8. Now I'm getting into, this is the criteria for which we identify something, right?
Yeah, okay, so I was wrong. Let's go back to premise 5 real quick. So this one is mostly an issue I have with the construction of this. It assumes some things, kind of like my objection to premise 1. So, if God chooses to utilize the divine agent revelation mechanism, then God is necessarily obligated to provide sufficient clarification method. I do not believe God is necessarily obligated to do anything. You have not established that God is necessarily obligated to do anything. So you would have to establish that this is a God who is, say, all-loving and who wants all people to be saved. Because there are other God concepts where, those gods wouldn't care whether people had a clarifying mechanism or not. And so I think this premise makes some assumptions that haven't been laid out in other premises.
It's so this is laid out in premise 1, even though it's not there. But when you do your write-up for this premise, I'm going to be defining what is God, and that definition will have to entail something that says this. So absolutely right in your observation that it depends on, well, what do we mean by God? Cool. Okay. So,
and premise 6, I didn't have any notes on that, but premise 7, I think there's probably some ground to be explored. So taking those other premises, and I'm listening to the premises charitably, because even though I don't think they're complete in their form, I know what you mean.
Should
So
I? Should I? Yeah, maybe. Should we just? I guess I made a mistake doing this. Like, maybe I should like go through each premise and explain what I mean for each one first, and then have the discussion.
well, we might have. I think that when we're done with the premises altogether, it might be a good idea to swing back around to premise one,
Yeah.
and because I think that's anchoring a lot of the assumptions in the other premises.
Okay. Okay.
So,
Cool. So for now, yeah,
so
just explain in a sentence or so. Like, what do you disagree with premise 7, and then we'll come back around afterwards.
sure. Um, and I'm trying to. Would you summarize this again, real quick, because I'm lost in the text. It's a
Okay.
this is something that not too many people know about me. It doesn't matter how big the print is, and I've got it pretty big on my screen. If it's all capital letters, it's really hard for me to read. It's
Yeah.
almost gibberish to me, and so I this is all caps, and it's really hard for me to skim.
So in a nutshell, if God used divine revelation to reveal our purpose to us, and God obviously wants us to use that to achieve it, and given the fact that there's this religion chaos problem, then the prior probability of a religion authenticating miracle or event is equally probable, at least for some events in certain circumstances. And I haven't defined what the premise 8 will define what those circumstances
Yeah,
are.
I'm going to largely agree with that. I don't necessarily want to, but because I think there's another assumption buried in here that might be covered under more discussion in premise one. But the assumption is that we have a divine purpose, number one, and that God wants us to fulfill our ultimate purpose, that these are driving goals of his, and it requires you to know something about what God wants. You have to know his mind somehow to assume this. And so, in further discussion, maybe we can talk about how one can be confident that you know that.
That would be premise 2. Yep.
So,
Cool.
anyway, that was kind of my thought there. But I think the main part of this premise that you were getting at wasn't even that. So that this may be somewhat pedantic. What you're trying to introduce, I think, is miracles, and to say that if there is such a God, and if this is what he was trying to do, then he might, use miracles as a way of letting you know, at least in some situations. And I agree with that.
Yeah. And the main point, it's against people like Anthony or Bart Ehrman and stuff. It's saying, look, under those circumstances, it's equally, there's an equal prior probability. Like, we can't say, oh no, well, it's incredibly improbable that God, properly defined in premise 1, and given that he has these motivations outlined in the other premises, then yeah, it's just up to him. Did he want to do it or not? Did he have a reason for doing it or not in this case?
Well, right, but I mean, I don't think that they would disagree with that either. But you've got to understand, I'm not pushing back on your basic assumptions. I'm just trying to make you make your assumptions more clearly. I'm listening to this generously, and saying, assuming the God that you say exists, and assuming certain characteristics of that God and certain characteristics of his plan, which is a lot to take on board. That's a lot to grant. You must recognize. And A66 and say Bart Ehrman or any number of people have not granted any of those things. And so not granting those things, I think they're perfectly reasonable in their stance. But if you grant all of the things that you are saying so far, then yes, I think it's personally perfectly reasonable to start with a 50-50 probability that sometimes he does miracles.
Okay, awesome. All right, cool. Yep, and obviously, yep. So we need to debate some prior premises then that this premise 7 is founded upon. So, okay, cool. So premise 8 is where I provide my criteria, and it says, well, look, there are events that can be sufficiently demonstrated on a balance of probabilities to a reasonable real seeker. That's it's not necessarily going to be demonstrated to everyone, right? But at the I should probably minimize this and say at the very least to any and all reasonable real seekers. But maybe there's religions where God provides sufficient evidence for everyone, right? So that kind of exposed a little bias. I should qualify that and say to at least every reasonable real seeker, and we can identify them. Sorry. So events that meet these specified criteria, and I'll show you my table in a second. I'll just quickly go over it. These would entail that many reasonable real seekers would reasonably infer that such events are religion authenticating events. So it's saying the reasonable real seekers, if they see an event that fits these criteria, they'll go, God is trying to authenticate this religion. That's what this premise says in a nutshell. Now, actually, you know what? I'm not going to go over the table yet because I'll save that when we go over it.
I don't think it's necessary yet, and I can make this one real simple. I disagree with the premise in total, and so we'll come back and have conversation. Because once I looked at it, I realized, we should do 5 through 7 first, because I think there's more than just some prior definition that's problematic with this particular premise.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. So premise 9 then is saying if God allowed an event as described in premise 8 to occur to authenticate a specific religion, but it in fact doesn't facilitate the achievement of Go 1. Remember, the maximum amount of humans possible achieving their ultimate purpose. If there's an event that fits this criteria for Christianity or Islam, but yet these religions are false or that they're not conducive for us achieving our ultimate purpose, then I just say many reasonable people would unnecessarily fail, unjustifiably, that should say, fail to achieve Go 1. And consequently, God would be demonstrated to be inconsistent with his own essential nature, again, as needs to be defined in premise 1. And that's logically impossible.
Right. So, again, I see lots of conversational opportunity. Let's get to the last two.
Okay. So, and there is an exception clause. One of the things is I'm going to be taking out premise 10 because I can incorporate this into premise 8. But with what I have up on the website, I just kept it the same now as an 11 premise 1. So there's a qualifier here, right? This would be the case. Premise 9 would be true unless, so I should have said, unless there are further clarifying mechanisms. Mm-hmm. So premise 10 is just denying there are no further clarifying mechanisms. Go ahead. And then premise 11 is that, okay, Christianity specifically has events fitting the criteria of being a religion authenticating event.
Okay. So let me just dive in to this a little bit so that I can begin to lay out my biggest objections.
So starting from premise 1, or
no? I think I've covered 1 through 7 as far as just identifying the things that I see as problematic. But I think the real work of this argument kind of is embedded in premise 8 through 11. Yes, there's a lot of definitional stuff that has to happen in the first 7 premises, but this is real work, I think, and I don't think that any set of premises can make this work. So, events which have been sufficiently demonstrated. Let me stop you right there. I don't know what sufficient demonstration is. And I don't think there's any way that we can define sufficient demonstration in a universal way. So what is sufficiently demonstrated to you is not necessarily going to be sufficiently demonstrated to me. And then you continue. I know I broke that up in a sentence. Sufficiently demonstrated to a reasonable person. Let me stop you right there. What is a reasonable person? There is a little bit of wiggle room there. I know that we don't disagree altogether in that. Otherwise, we really couldn't have conversations with people. If we thought they were unreasonable, we shouldn't have conversations with them. Conversations where reason is involved. So we have some idea of what a reasonable person is, but I've got a feeling that as we bring religion into it, it's going to be much harder to figure out what we mean by reasonable person. And knowing that we've had this conversation before, I know that we're not going to meet there. So we've got sufficient demonstration. We've got reasonable person. On the balance of probabilities, this is also a little bit challenging because this assumes that the average reasonable person is good at figuring out probabilities. And I would say that they are not. And so you're already taking this into a realm that would probably leave out much of the population. As I skim through here, there was, I remember there was something about real seeking, and I know that you were kind of massaging this as you were talking through it, but now we've got to determine, okay, well, what exactly do we mean by a real seeker? I mean, we're both looking at this G-authenticating event, and I see it one way, you see it another way. You see it as convincing, I don't. We're both reasonable persons, but maybe if I'm not a real enough seeker, then that's why I don't see it. And so I just kind of have to take your word for this, which seems a little bit ad hoc. Okay, well, he said I was unreasonable, so I guess that's why I don't see it. It's very difficult to pin down any of that, and that's where I think the work of the thesis has to happen. And I think that there are a lot of things in there that just presume. So 9, just going through this again real quickly. Occurring relationships is said of that were false. Okay. Sure. Okay. So there may be some events that seem like clarifying events that God has set about to lead you to the right path, but they really weren't clarifying events. And so we have to put some boundaries around what a clarifying event is. And you start to do that work, I think, here in this one. But again, it feels a little bit ad hoc because Christians disagree on various events and whether they qualify as a unique clarifying event or not. And so it seems trivial to say that many reasonable people who are seeking God don't know what a clarifying event is. And so I appreciate the fact that you're trying to put some borders around that. And I think that it's a fair discussion to have to say, well, what events really qualify? But at some point, it's just, me taking your word for it. This is what you think qualifies, as opposed to another Christian who disagrees with that and think, no, the fences should be in different places around that. So Christianity has events fitting the criteria. I don't know that they do. I mean, if you define, the criteria in the events very specifically, and you kind of declare yourself a hegemon of Christianity and say these are the events, then I would say you're right. Christianity does have events fitting the criteria because you made the criteria. and you declared that it was so. But
Yeah.
it's not so much if you're asking us to all look at it, with our own best lights and come to an agreement of that. So I obviously don't believe that Christianity has those clarifying events, and so we clearly disagree on what would qualify as a clarifying event. And I think that clarifying events ultimately are different for different people because some people have more or less intellect to look into things and understand. Take, for instance, the shroud. It's a very intellectual field. You gotta.
I know
Uh,
you're just listing, but because so here's an example where you do have all of my reasoning for free because I've written that 300-page chapter on the shroud. Would you?
right.
I get that you are taking issue with the criteria. Am I justified on something's being a religion authenticating event? Who cares, kind of thing. And that's where we'll have a dispute on other premises. But do you at least agree that the shroud evidence does fulfill this criteria for being a religion authenticating event, as I've defined it, at least?
As you've defined it, sure.
Okay, cool.
But that there's a lot of work in that, right? So I was mentioning the shroud, not to debate the shroud. I was just saying that it's one of those things where you have to be fairly intelligent, very well read, to even follow the quote unquote evidence of the shroud. It's not something that is accessible to the average person. I'm just going to shout her out because I love her. Teddy's working on a book on the shroud, which I wish she would just hurry up and write. Just keep moving the cursor to the right, Teddy. The bits and pieces that I've read, it's good. I like it just fine, but it's deep. And if you think that this is, some clarifying event for the average person, it is not. It might be for some people, but it's not for other people. And that's why I say inherently, you can't define a clarifying event with specific criteria because we're all different and we require different criteria.
Okay. All right, cool. So, yeah, I think at this point, because I have responses to all that, a lot of that stuff that you said, I think every single one out wanted to say something. So let's do this then. Let's go back and let's fill out each premise a little bit and take our time going over it then and going over some of your objections and stuff, right? So premise one, hey, I'm talking to an atheist here. So obviously you deny premise one that God exists. Now in the first place, so the first thing when you're filling this out, when I'm providing the warrant for the truth of this premise, the first thing I would do is define my terms. So, what does it mean to exist? Okay, I think we'll both basically agree, but just for me, just out of interest, existence just means there's the presence of a belonging or an exemplification relation. So something, regardless of what type of thing that is, exemplifies certain properties. When that happens, that thing exists. Um, I don't think we're going to dispute that. But next, the definition of God. So God, for me, in a nutshell, is minimally a real, maximally great being, as Eugen Nagasawa defines. Right? He has all of the all of the great making properties. Let's say. I can define it without that because I know that's going to be an issue, but this is my definition. So yeah, he has all of the great making properties to the maximal possible degree. That is minimally what God is. He may be other stuff. Maybe he's a Trinity. Maybe he has a human nature, whatever. But the minimal definition, the definition that I have in mind at this point, because I was a non-Christian when I made this, is he's a real maximally great being. That's what God is. And that means he's a personal being. He has at least one person or more within his being. He has libertarian free will. He's got power, knowledge, goodness, and benevolence to the maximal possible degree. Stuff like that. Does that help in terms of the definition? First of all,
I suppose, but I mean, all I can do is shrug my shoulders and say, okay. I can't validate any of these things. I don't necessarily think all of those things are necessary to be a god, even religiously speaking. Even in the Judeo Christian sense of religiously speaking. I don't think that you have to believe, for instance, that God is three persons. I don't think that you have to believe any form of that. For instance, for this God to be real, and I do think that's a part of the defining nature of God for Christians that you can't just jettison. Well, how do you get there? I don't know. So you declare that this is the God that you are kind of, sorry how foreign
Well,
this term sounds, but it sounds like you're just defining a God into existence. And who am I to, question any part of the definition you want to give it? God also, loves Rocky Road ice cream. I just defined that aspect of God into existence. Who are you to say that's not true?
okay, so but no, because I haven't defined anything into existence. I've just given you a definition of what I mean, and try him being triune is not a part of it. I said my definition is consistent with it, but essentially it's a real maximally great being. That's my definition of God.
Right. I understand that. It's a real maximally great being, but once again, I don't. That's not any part of my definition of a God. I had a kind of a discussion online where it talked about there could be a possibility of a God that I could believe in, or that would exist. The problem is my definition of God is not something that any Christian would agree on as definition of God. So I disagree, with your definition of God doesn't match with one that I would believe in, and mine doesn't match with one that you would believe in. And so once again, I am just accepting your definition of God. I can't interrogate it further. I can't really, there's nothing that I can do, except to have this conversation. I just have to accept your definition of God and go from there.
So you don't, right? Because once I define what I'm talking about, then we can ask, well, is premise one true? Does this God, as Dale defines him, exist or not? And correct me if I'm wrong. I guarantee you I'm mishearing you, but I'm getting a little excited because it sounded to me like you were saying, well, your definition of God is a real maximally great being. You are open like to him existing.
No,
You just said
no, I don't agree with that. That is not a aspect of God that would be a part of my definition of a God that I would believe in.
okay.
So sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't.
I got excited for a second, but
Yeah, sorry about
okay.
that.
Cool.
Calm down, everybody.
So this is where we get into the warrant for premise one, right? So this is where we would get into arguments for God's existence, God defined minimally as a real maximum great being. And we also have arguments against that conception of God's existence. And we would need to assess the evidence and
Yeah,
decide.
I noticed that creator wasn't in your definition
Oh,
that you were
that's there
just given.
too. That has to be there too.
Yeah.
Yes, creator of the universe, because that's going to be, and creator of human beings. That's going to be essential to when we're discussing premise two. So that is a part of the definition as well. He's the creator and sustainer of everything that exists.
Okay. Again, I don't see any need for a God to be a creator. I don't see the need for a creator God to be maximally great or great in any way. And so, once we can talk about warrant. I don't want to let this devolve though into a debate of is God real? Is there a God? You can do that on YouTube all day
Yeah.
and not scratch the surface. So I just don't even find it particularly interesting. Suffice it to say, you believe that a God exists, and I don't, and we're only just trying to get a clear definition of the kind of God that you are saying exists. So, for an atheist is never going to get on board with the 11 premises because premise one is there.
Yeah.
But if we were just, say, for instance, judging these premises as an academic exercise, and you're presenting a thesis, a proper thesis, you do have to define that God somehow and provide at least some kind of justification for the God that you've defined there in order to move on to other premises.
Exactly. That is exactly right. And yeah, and like David was saying, we're not going to get it into it for this show, but just understand, like this isn't because I've had complaints from you yourself before, David, and from atheists like Darren and stuff on SNS, where you'll say, well, you just have presuppositions. But no, just because premise one says God exists, that's when philosophers write their entire books trying to say, well, here are reasons why we think premise one is true. And that's where your cosmological argument, ontological argument versus hiddenness of God, and you get into all of that discussion. So for the point of our conversation here, I've done that, although I haven't written it all out yet. But I've done that during my religious research phase for myself, and I've come out as saying, yeah, I think it's more probable than not that God exists. So this premise number one is true. Obviously, we need to debate that, but yeah, if you're happy with that, let's presume God exists going forward into premise two then.
Yeah, I mean, and again, I would just more state it as this is my concept of God. If that God exists, then see premise two. And I think that's an easier way to onboard people into the ideas than just to say the God that I believe exists.
Well, no, yeah, I think that it's essential in order for the argument to work. We need this factual premise. Right? The argument doesn't work if it's just a hypothetical. So I do need to prove that God, as I defined him, exists. Otherwise, this argument fails, in my opinion.
Okay, I was just trying to provide a way forward that I'm pretty sure that atheists could get on board here, because they always have the out of saying, yeah, but I don't think that God exists. However, if the God that you defined it exists, then we can see if your other premises follow, and then it's just the work of the atheists in their lifetime, in their encounters, with this God or not, to discover whether he exists. Because if so, then we've already shown that the other premises work. But if they have to start with God exists, it's going to alienate rather than inform.
No, I see. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah. So I'll just finish this and put it this way to clarify for the audience. So logically speaking, if we're interested in the truth of my 11 premise argument, I have to get into the details with David and knock him to shreds, and rip him to shreds, and prove God does exist. Atheism is wrong. If I can't do that, if premise one fails, if you prove that God, as I define him, does not exist, my argument logically fails. It's game over. But for practical conversation purposes, we've kind of mentioned that, yeah, we disagree, and there needs to be work here. There needs to be arguments. Let's argue the cosmological argument. Let's argue the ontological argument. We need to hash that out first. But for practical purposes, David's saying, well, okay, cool. We get where we disagree here. Let's assume that I admit now God exists, and let's see if I agree with the rest of your premises or not. So cool. Hopefully that clarifies. But okay, yeah, so
I find that a reasonable compromise. Otherwise, what you're telling people is premise one, now go to YouTube and listen to all the debates on whether God exists, and then come back to premise two.
Pretty much, yeah, exactly. My cosmological argument alone is over 12 hours, so have fun, guys.
Yeah.
Okay, so premise two, great. We've got practically speaking, pragmatically speaking, we're assuming God exists as I define him. Now, if God exists as I define him, this real maximally great being exists, then what I call these G outcomes exist. One of which is the maximum number of human beings possible achieving their ultimate purpose in creation, whatever that is. I don't know what the ultimate purpose is at this point. I'm not specifying. Maybe it's for us to eat a bunch of cheese pizzas. I don't know. So what can I say about this? So
okay. Let me just tell you one of the things that you can say about it, because you'll recall in previous discussions we've had, this is one of my sticking points, which is you don't know that there is an ultimate purpose. We humans do all kinds of things all the time that don't have ultimate purposes. People have kids without having an ultimate purpose for doing it. There were whoops. So this presumes that humans even have an ultimate purpose, and that God wants to maximize the number of beings that fulfill that ultimate purpose. Uh, I'm these seem like reasonable ideas, but there's nothing inherent about premise one that makes premise two true.
Okay, so I think it does, and here's my reasoning as to why I think this premise two is true if we have a God as I describe him in premise one. So, in the first place, in terms of ultimate purpose, that it may just be semantics between us. I'm just as happy as if you say purpose in creation, but the point I was trying to get is that there may be multiple purposes. Some are more important to God than not, and the main thing is God, as defined there, whatever his most important purpose for. So this is why God has to be a creator, because he creates the universe. He's also the creator, at least indirectly, of human beings as well.
But I accept. I'm granting
Yeah, but
those
so
premises. What the
no, no,
analogy that I didn't make very well. I just want to make it really clear. Humans procreate all the time, and I can tell you the ultimate purpose for most of it is because they were horning. They don't have any ultimate purpose or purpose at all for their kids. They procreated because they had a need and they did it and they were done. And so you have to show that God
so that
actually had a purpose.
so that doesn't apply to God, right? Because you're talking about accidental conception. God is an omnipotent being, or he's maximally powerful, where such accidents don't happen. So that's another aspect where God's attributes come in. Also, because he's a free will, libertarian free will agent, which needs to be argued for in premise one as well. I argue based on secular philosophical grounds that even non-theistic philosophers admit that one of the criteria for having freedom is the rationality condition. Basically, you have a reason or rationale for, at the very least, your significant moral or ultimate purposes or choices that you make. So therefore, this would follow. I would use this argumentation and flesh it out when I'm doing my warrant part here in my book as to why I think, well, if God created human beings and the universe, but human beings is the important part here, then he must have had a reason for choosing to bring these people about. And because he's God, he's omnipotent, omniscient, all of this stuff, he will achieve that ultimately, kind of thing.
Okay.
So
I'm willing to let that objection sit there. Is mostly, I thought that's something that required some clarification that you should address. I accept that you have addressed it.
oh, awesome. And okay, cool, awesome, yeah. So because that's one of my favorite premises that I really want to get into. I've never done a show, but I'm looking forward to eventually writing that out and getting into the philosophy of mind and talking about the conditions for freedom and stuff. So, all right, cool. So you accept that? I'm feeling very
No,
happy.
well, I accept that you have addressed it. I don't I don't agree with it, but I accept that you have addressed it. I'm not I'm not I'm not here to debate your premises as much as to get them out to the world and have them clarified. And I think that's one of the things that people need it to have clarified. And I accept that you have done that. I think there's more pushback to be had, but I think that this is a good clarifying statement on your part, and I'm willing to leave it at that.
All right, cool. Awesome. Awesome. Yeah, I'm really excited about this show. So, okay, premise three. Guess what? David already said he kind of accepts this, but so it's basically just saying God can achieve this ultimate purpose for human beings by using divine revelation. This is just one mechanism he can say to say, hey, these sets of beliefs or actions or whatever, follow these ones, and then you'll achieve this go one result. And here's the means by which you can accomplish that, and stuff like that. So, yeah, I know you said you already agree with this.
Yeah,
Is there?
I don't see anything there to object to. Now, that doesn't mean that I think divine revelation is a good method, but you just said it's a method he could use.
Mhm.
And you're setting up some other things with that, and I would agree. Yeah, that's a method he could use. I think possibly an even better method that he could use would be to create the rails, as it were, so that we cannot stray from his path to begin with. And so you wouldn't need any revelation in that sense, because this is the only way to go. Now, I'm not going to sit and debate that. There are lots of things that can be done. Divine revelation has other problems, though, potential problems, because whereas something may have been divinely revealed, you may not realize that this was a divine revelation that's being revealed to you unless you are conscious that this divine revelation is happening, and unless you have a way of a mechanism of understanding with, I would say 100% certainty of what is being revealed to you and what is expected of you. And I would say that with that criteria, we could eliminate divine revelation as something that he did, because we don't have any of that. But that said, generically speaking, I have no problem with saying that a God who has these desires and goals that you set out, one of the ways that he could do that is with divine revelation. Okay.
Yeah, it's an uncontroversial premise, right? So, all right, cool. So, premise 4, you are wholeheartedly smiling at this. If I could see your face, I bet. But look, there's divine revelation confusion. There's chaos. Is the Quran the divine revelation? Is the Bible? Is the Hindu the Rig Veda? Where the heck is this divine revelation? Human beings, at least en masse, are at least at large, are confused. There's an issue. We don't know exactly where it is.
Which is one of the reasons why divine revelation probably not the best idea.
So. Fair enough. Well, my argument doesn't argue for the best, so who cares? But there's counters to that, obviously. But yeah, I'll just let that go. So, okay, premise 5. I can't remember if I think you accepted this, but you had some kind of issue with clarification. Okay, so I'll just read it, and then you can remind me what you said about it. So if God did choose to use divine revelation, and it's a fact that we have this divine revelation problem on Earth, where a lot of humans are confused about which religion is true, then God is obligated. Oh, that's where you objected. Yeah. Then God is obligated to provide a sufficient clarification mechanism to address this problem. Now, you understand I'm defining God as a real maximally great being, minimally here.
Mm-hmm.
Does that change your objection here? Because I think it does follow.
I don't think that you can obligate God in any way at any time, the way he's often described. I don't think that he's obligated to do that. For instance, this God he may have revealed divine revelation and hidden it among other things that just look like divine revelation, and it could just be a big scavenger hunt. And it could be that what God wants is not just the most free will people to choose to follow him, but he also wants the smartest people to choose to follow him. And so only those people who can freely and successfully make their way through the scavenger hunt and decode the clues, only they get to be saved, and those are the people that he wants to maximize. So you are assuming that he wants as many possible people to fulfill their ultimate purpose, but but you've already put fences around that, and your fence is free will. Okay, well, we can easily put another fence around that: free will, intelligent people, right? So there's nothing in your premises that would keep that from being true. And so that being the case, premise 5 is simply wrong you can't obligate this God to provide sufficient clarification mechanism if he is trying to test for the most intelligent people.
Well, I don't see that your objection. I can take on board everything you said, and I don't get confused. I think you have in mind where I'm qualifying the types of people in premise 8. That hasn't come up yet. So let's
Okay.
take maybe the only people, human beings possible to achieve their ultimate purposes are have free will. I don't know why that's coming up. And they, I guess, because for me, free will is part of how they achieve this goal, but I haven't assumed that yet, right? Because I don't know what the goal is. And they've got to be sufficient intelligent. Well, God has provided a sufficient clarification mechanism for everyone with the required intelligence and free will that can possibly achieve their ultimate purpose. So he has fulfilled premise 5. He's given them the scavenger hunt, and that's the clarification mechanism. And he's given some people the brains to do it.
So I could almost swear that you had mentioned in your summary of this free will earlier, because you were qualifying it so that if you don't include that in your definition of achieving our ultimate purpose, then you leave yourself open to, yeah, well, it's easy for us to achieve our ultimate purpose if God puts life on rails so that we can't go wrong. But that's not what you mean. You actually are thinking about free will, which is why life is not on rails and you can go left and right and off course and off the cliff because it's a matter of free will. And so I take that as a part of the basic premises, whether spoken or unspoken, to get to this place, that free will is a part of it. And so if you're saying it's not a part of it,
Not up to this not up to this point. Yeah. I don't see where I need to assume the people. Like, part of my argument does assume God has libertarian free will. Like, that's necessary for my argument for premise 2.
okay, but why is he obligated then? Explain it in premise 5. Why is he obligated to provide anything? He would like you to, maximize your ultimate purpose, but
Yeah.
but he doesn't have to. He could just watch you stumble around bumping into walls. Why is he obligated to provide sufficient clarification?
So I think it's because he is this real maximally great being, and it wouldn't be really maximally great if this being had a goal and he provided the means to achieve that goal through divine revelation. And
Okay,
then,
well, once again, that's where free will is assumed, and I guess that's where I keep hearing it, whether you're saying it or not. Because if we're saying maximally great and we're defining maximally great, then I would say that it would be maximally greater for him to just save everybody and lead everybody to their ultimate purpose. That's not what you believe. That's not where we're going. So you do have some
no,
fences and
no,
boundaries around this.
no. Well, see, you're assuming maybe universalism is true up to this point, right? We're
Okay.
not assuming Christianity. Maybe through divine revelation, every human being will be saved. Like,
Which
again,
also would abrogate the point that you're trying to make with number 5, because you're saying God is obligated to provide sufficient clarification mechanism. He is not. He could leave it perfectly confusing and save everybody anyway. So it's I'm trying to figure out
no, because
where
okay,
you're putting this obligation on God to do that, because he can achieve whatever outcome he wants without providing a sufficient clarification mechanism.
but if he has chosen divine revelation as the way he's going to reveal the truth, or reveal which religion people should follow, and there is this religion chaos problem that's going to prevent them from achieving their ultimate purpose, then he has to provide some clarification mechanism so
Not
that
if universalism is true.
nobody he does, because again, the even under universalism, everyone has to be saved through this divine revelation. Now, obviously, you're going to point to, well, in the real world, no, not everybody comes to the same religion. Well, maybe they're saved in the afterlife. There's clarification mechanisms in the afterlife, so they realize it. Again, we can't assume Christianity here. My premises are not assuming my religious theological beliefs about salvation and heaven and hell yet. Um, so I think that everything you're saying, at least up to this point of premise 5, where we don't know what the divine revelation is, it could be it's consistent with clarification mechanisms regardless of what point you want to put on me. And God's the reason we know this, that God is obligated and has to do this, is because he can't fail to achieve his goals. If the means by which he is achieving his goal for humans is through divine revelation, but that's screwed up because of the chaos problem, then he can't just say, oh well, I guess I won't achieve that. No, he's got to achieve that goal, otherwise he's not really maximally great.
Okay. Yeah, so this is going to be an agree to disagree. I think I'll put a pin in it. Maybe we can come back. But one of the what we said in a prior premise was that it is perfectly consistent that God could use some kind of divine revelation as a clarification method. We didn't say he did,
Right.
And we didn't say that it was a good method. We just said it's possible that he could use that. But it seems like we've now made some kind of declaration by saying then that God is obligated to provide a sufficient clarification mechanism. We haven't defined or decided what God's goal is. He could have used divine revelation, or he could have used some other things, but now you're just assuming that he used divine revelation, and then you're jumping to premise 5, and we never established that he did, only that he could have.
Right. So look at the wording. It's a hypothetical. If God did choose to use divine revelation, and then he's obligated, right? But so another
Okay.
answer that I didn't think of with universalism. Okay, well then, if universalism was true, then maybe God doesn't have to use divine revelation, because whatever happens happens. So okay, no divine revelation, no need to address that problem or something. You could argue that way. If I think that's the way
Well,
you're
that's kind of how I was trying to argue it.
sure.
It's very odd here where we are. You are a Christian trying to give God obligation, and I am a skeptic trying to say that God doesn't have any obligation. That feels backwards.
Yeah, I think it's no. I think that's Christians that say that are foolish, because no, God is obligated. He's morally perfect, so therefore he's obligated internally through his own nature to be morally perfect. God cannot sin or rape a baby for fun. That's not dependent on me being a Christian or not. There are certain entailments given his attributes that I've proven in premise 1, hypothetically, for the sake of argument,
Right.
that have entailments. And if this premise is saying, look, I don't know if God did use divine revelation, maybe universalism is true and he didn't use it because everyone's saved anyways. But if he did use it and we have this divine revelation problem, well, then a real maximally great being dang well better clarify which divine revelation am I going to look at to achieve my purpose. That
Couldn't it be a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B though? Like for instance, you could say his original plan was to use divine revelation, but sin entered the world, and so divine revelation was screwed up, and so plan B is he's going to just save everybody, universalism. Why would that be inconsistent?
So it, under the so again we're saying in the for Christianity specifically here, which again is not part of my 11 premise argument, but let's assume that God did use divine revelation. He orally revealed to Adam and Eve, if you're taking Genesis literally and stuff like that, look, don't eat that fruit, that's bad, this is the fruit you eat, don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They did, the fall happened. Then what was the second part of your question? So they became confused.
Right. So divine revelation kind of went out the window when everyone is confused and now no one understands spiritual things. And so you got to have some kind of a plan B. And plan B is, well, you know what? Since everyone's spiritual mechanism is broken, I'm going to just save them anyway because I'm God and I love them.
Okay. So that could be the case, but I think there is something that I should spell out in premise 3 here, because when I'm talking about God using divine revelation, it's not just direct. Oh, well, he did divine revelation to one person, Adam and Eve, and then he didn't intend divine revelation to be the mechanism for most humans or all humans throughout history.
No. I'm saying he did intend. I'm granting that he did, but because sin broke our ability to understand spiritual things,
Okay.
in the same way, we were supposed to live forever. But sin came and broke our ability to live forever, and now we got to deal with death. Right. So there's a plan B. There's the original plan, then there's a plan B that we're living with. And so I'm just saying I could get on board with the idea that God had some kind of divine revelation plan, but sin has really mucked that up pretty bad now. And so there has to be a plan B
I think
because plan A is impossible for humans because we're spiritually broken.
but that's exactly what I'm arguing, right? Like, so he gave divine revelation starting with Adam and Eve, then the fall messed it up and we led to this chaos problem. So his plan B, which he's obligated to do, is he provided clarification mechanisms. What is that? Well, we're going to be saying, well,
Right.
merit, religion, authenticating events or something.
So we're just going around in circles again because when you said and therefore he's obligated to, and that's where I'm saying no, he's not. He can still save people without fooling with the clarification mechanism. We're all confused. He could try to unconfuse us by the clarification mechanism, but that's not the only option in front of him. He could use other options.
Okay.
And so that's the thing that I'm pushing against. But I do believe that
I think you're right. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just saying I think the audience gets where our difference is, and so I'm willing to stop arguing my side.
No, so you've proven your point. I would say, yeah, I fully agree. If that's what God wanted to do, he used divine revelation temporarily and that failed. And then he didn't intend divine revelation to save the rest. He had some other means. That could be true. That could be true. Cool. That's consistent with my argument as well. But my argument is trying to get at the fact that, okay, divine revelation was given, there was a problem, and he still wants to use divine revelation to achieve his purposes. Well, then how would he do that? In order to do that, he would be obligated to provide a clarification mechanism.
Yeah. So if I were to amend this premise at all, I would just add the if in there. If God is still interested in using divine revelation, then he's required to provide sufficient clarification mechanism. I think I could go with that.
That's yeah. I will when I do the warrant for. I'll update premise 5 because that's a really good point that I didn't think of. I'm kind of just baked in here. I'm just assuming. Look, divine revelation is the means for all time, even after the fall and stuff like that. So yeah, that's a great point. I will update that.
Okay.
All right. So premise 6. What is religion? What I'm calling religion authenticating events or miracles, attesting to the endorsement of a religion by God, is an example of a clarifying mechanism God could use to address this divine revelation problem, chaos problem.
Yes. Yeah. Given your definition of God and what he's capable of, and I still have trouble granting the what he wants to do part because I still don't see how we could tell what he would want to do. But even granting that, then yes, he can use some type of authenticating events. Now, I think the use of authenticating events in this way is problematic because it still requires us to try to figure it out. and so this is where some of my objections come in with number 7 and what follows. So you can say, well, God did use this authenticating event, and I'm like, oh, I didn't realize that was an authenticating event. I thought that was just nature taking its course. Or yes, okay, that was a magical thing that happened, but the world is full of magic. Even the Bible talks about plenty of magic. And so I don't see how just because we proved that there was some miracle that happened, or some magic that happened from a preacher who was talking about Jesus, that magic is somehow more important than the magic of some other preacher talking about some other God. So I don't actually think that it is a particularly good way of clarifying the events, but God can use whatever He wants, I suppose. If He wants to use those kinds of events, He can. I don't think it gets Him where He wants to be, though.
So what I hear your objection is you're kind of saying these miracle religion authenticating events, as I'm calling them, which aren't just miracles, by the way, but
I understand.
um, obviously for my argument, it's going to be miracles that I'm looking at. But you're saying, well, look, this isn't a sufficient clarifying mechanism, and the thing that I would just counter is I would say no, premise 6 is correct, but the examples that you're pointing out to are going to be issues that I deal with in premise 8 when we get to how do we identify it. But I could just say the examples you're giving aren't properly religion authenticating events. So there are some miracles that aren't religion authenticating events. So I think my premise could be upheld in saying that the examples that you're offering as defeaters to try and argue that it's not a clarifying mechanism are just wrong because they're not examples of religion authenticating events in the first place.
Okay. Well, I would argue that there are plenty of religious authenticating miraculous events that are claimed through history. Whether you believe they happen or not is kind of irrelevant, because I don't believe the Christian ones happened. So if we're just talking about miracle claims of people that authenticate their religious ramblings, history is lousy with them.
Okay. So yeah. So obviously we'll get into the criteria, but how do we identify what is a religion authenticating event? But I would just
Also, I just apologize because I may have sidetracked it a little bit. I did agree that God definitely could use these types of events. I just wanted to explain a little bit why I think it's a bad idea to do that, because it doesn't really clarify anything in my book. But
let me ask it this way then. Stop assuming what I have in mind because we haven't got to premise 7 and 8 yet. I prefer religion authenticating events, whatever they are, if they are sufficient to be demarcated as such. You would agree that would be a good example of a clarifying mechanism
uh, yeah, I mean, I'm being as generous as I can, while trying to be as honest and provide pushback where it needs to be. Um, I think part of my problem is I don't think that you can come up with an example of a religion clarifying event that I would agree with. Because no matter what event you come up with, I can show you why that's not the clarifying event you think it is, or why you're leaving out clarifying events for other people's religion. And so it still kind of becomes a matter of judgment of which events you think are clarifying events. And I just don't think that it is possible to do that.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. So and I do, and that's where we're gonna have our fun time on premise 8.
Yeah.
Kind of, is it true or are all my criteria a bunch of crock? As there are no religion authenticating events, not even the ones I think that there are. So okay. So premise 7 is again about that prior probability question, right? So it's again, it's assuming the prior premises that Go One exists and that God exists as a real maximum great being, and that he did choose to. So see, David, it's an if, it's a conditional if, and he chose to use divine revelation. And there's this problem, so that's a long antecedent here. Then the prior probability of a religion authenticating event being used as a clarifying mechanism is equally probable, and for some events in certain circumstances. What are those? We're going to talk about that in premise 8. But David, I remember you actually agreed with premise 7 the way it was worded.
Yeah, but I've got to add some clarifications around that, though. I'm sorry.
No problem. No, that's why we're here.
So the word equally, I still don't think that you can say equally. You can definitely say it's possible and even probable to some degree of probability. Equally suggests that you know the degree of probability, and this doesn't justify that assumption. For some events, a possible explanation for some events in certain circumstances. Sure, for some events in certain circumstances, these possible explanations could be 50-50, but that's not the case for all of the things that you might think of as geauthenticating events. So, for instance, if you have a God who is, part of his oeuvre is to not do many miracles, he only does a handful of miracles in a generation, then it's not fair to say that in all circumstances, or even in most circumstances, it's a 50-50 possibility, because it's not, because this is a God who doesn't do many miracles. And so you should change the probabilities just on that fact alone. But I mean, you've qualified this one almost so much that it's, by the time we get to equally possible, it doesn't mean anything anymore. There are too many qualifiers.
Well, and actually I'm missing one. I just realized premise 6 should be in there as well. So it's a long antecedent. It's a conjunction. There's a lot of ands. But again, it's just following what we've already established, at least for the sake of argument here in the prior premises. And then it's saying, well, if that's the case, so I have here, and then I should say, and he's done a religion authenticating event, used it as a clarifying mechanism. Well, then the prior probability in those sets
right, but then if we add, though, that he doesn't do this often,
I don't think that matters either for any specific individual case, because we're assessing the probability that this specific event, maybe this is one of those rare events, right? So I don't think it's a numbers game like that. Why do I assign 50-50? Why is it equally probable? And I don't think that necessary especially for God, but even for humans, it doesn't matter what his prior behavior is at all. As long as we know that God is defined as a real maximum being, so he has the ability to do all this stuff and will and stuff like that. It's a question of him being a libertarian free will agent, right? So it doesn't make sense for you to go, Dale, pretend you believe in libertarian free will for me. I know that you disagree with that, but you get what I'm saying here. Given we're assuming that it's 50. What is the prior probability that I would sign up for philosophy? Look at my past behavior. I never cared about philosophy at all. I took business administration. I had no inkling or caring about it.
But I don't think it was 50-50 either at the time. The probability could have been 199, but as long as it was there was a chance that you would go into philosophy. So the chances, the probabilities have nothing to do with the fact that you went into philosophy.
I think okay, so I'm not going to say I think it does because I don't understand what I think you're
You're
doing.
saying it was a
Oh,
50-50 chance you would go into philosophy, but based
that would
on
be
your life up to that point and based on your desires in your own mind, it wasn't a 50-50.
so. So here's the thing, because you're assessing what is the prior probability, kind of statistically or randomly, that I would go into philosophy given my prior behavior, and that's not what we're assessing here. We're talking about what is the probability that I would sign up for a philosophy course given these antecedent clauses, that I had the motivation, the influences, the circumstances, money, whatever was needed for me to take that thing. Then it would be 50-50
It
kind
would not be 50-50 because, well, if you included motivation, I'm sorry. So if it was a matter of you were weighing your options and either one was fine to you, then sure, you could say 50-50. But what you told me is you had no interest in philosophy, or you implied that you had no interest in philosophy. And so it wouldn't have been proper to say there's a 50-50 chance.
So okay, yeah, so I misphrased that. Obviously it'd be 100 if I had all the motivations and stuff like that. But I think what I was thinking of here is I'm not assuming in advance. I'm just kind of saying, if God has these things, then it would be 100%. So yeah, this premise I have kind of messed up here, because my premise is kind of assuming, no, okay, so no, it's not. It's, and he's used a religion authenticating event.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. I think the problem with your premise isn't the thing that you're going to. I'm not going to let you torpedo it that way. I'm just, and also I have agreed tentatively with the premise, which is to say there is at least, given all of the antecedents, at least some event, whether we can properly identify it or not, where it's 50-50, that it was God doing it. But you don't even, you have to, then you have to make the case of, well, but we know which events those are. And I think your premise also has to, it's kind of trivially to say what you've said in the premise, because you could also say with those same antecedents, and that some events are 99% probable that they're an authenticating event, and some events are 1% probable. But it's a very trivial thing that you've left open in that premise, and so it doesn't really say, I think, what you're trying to get it to say.
Yeah, so I think it does, but I do need to qualify stuff and whatever. But the thing that I'm getting is prior probability, right? So that would be 50-50. Either God chose to do it or he didn't, kind of thing, in advance of the evidence. Where it's just saying, look, we don't know. If God had the capability and ability to do this, no problem, given who he is. So it's just a question of, well, does he have the motivation necessarily to will to do that or not?
Okay,
And
let me just ask you a clarifying question, and I'm willing to move forward, but I just want to make sure I understand your position. So it is possible that an authenticating event could be a storm that kills more than 100 people. That's possible. It's also possible that weather just happens. And so sometimes God may manipulate weather to happen so that it kills 100 people because he has a purpose for it. And there are other times when it happened because those are the patterns that were set in motion, and he didn't have any particular plan for it. Would you say that every time there's a storm that kills 100 people, that it's a 50-50 possibility that it's a geauthenticating event?
no, but I see this as kind of an objection for premise eight. What I'm trying to say, I guess, we have this question: did God? Obviously, I need to fix up the premise here, but what I'm trying to say is, did God have the will to do this religion authenticating event? And in that case, because of who God is, and the fact that he's a free will agent, the prior probability before we examine the evidence and stuff would be equally probable for this free will agent. Yeah, if he had the motivations and stuff, then he would do it. If he didn't have the motivations and stuff to will to do it, then he wouldn't do it. So
Yeah, well, but then I would just say that your statement isn't strong enough, because what you should say in 7 is, given all of the antecedents, there's 100% probability that God did this.
yeah, well, so that's where I'm kind of I need to reword things, right? Because this premise isn't supposed to be assuming that God does have the motivation. It's saying, well,
But
look,
you're saying, if, given all of the things that we've covered so far, and I would say that given all the things that you covered so far, if I just granted them, without objection, then your statement should read, then God has 100% probability of doing this sometimes.
yeah, you're totally right. Given that he has everything necessary to will to do this, it would be 100%. I mean,
Right. And you're not making a commitment to when those times are. You're just saying that some of the times God did this, and there's 100% chance he did.
yeah, but that's not what I'm intending to do with this premise. So that's why I've screwed up here. I need to reword it. What I'm trying to say is that given who God is, there's an equal probability that he willed to do this event or that he didn't will to do it, and we don't know until we evaluate the evidence. So yeah, this is kind of a screw up for me a little bit.
Yeah.
Uh,
So
that's
I think
good.
I think it's just challenging, and so people who are better philosophical thinkers than me, and who have worked with premises more than me, which is almost everybody, skepticsandseekers.squarespace.com. You will be first hearing this on Dale's Real Seeker Ministries, but I'd love to hear from you, and you are welcome to set me straight. Premise 8, sir.
Yeah, no, this is great. You've set me straight in this case. So I have some work to do to kind of fix up what I'm trying to say here a bit. So okay, so premise 8, David, we've been dancing around this all day. So this is where we get into the criteria for identifying such events, and I'm saying events which have been sufficiently demonstrated on a balance of probabilities to a specific type of person, reasonable, real seeker, at least minimally, right? Maybe it's to everybody or whatever, but minimally it has to be to these guys that meet the certain criteria below. They're not below, but I'll show you in a second. This would entail that at least many of these reasonable real seekers would infer that such events are religion authenticating events. And I realize I don't even need to say that they're reasonable necessarily, just the fact that they are reasonable persons. They would make this inference, many of them. Now,
Well, they
what are
couldn't be a
these?
real seeker if they were not reasonable persons. So I would agree that one of those is redundant.
Yeah, that's why I was okay, get rid of it. But okay, so what are these criteria? So here's where I'm going to show you guys something new. So let me stop sharing the PowerPoint. And here's going to be a heck of a confusing table that I'm going to try to make more sense of. Okay, so 4 to 5 criteria. All right, share the screen. Okay, so are you seeing the Word document?
I am not.
Oh, no. Oh, shoot. You were seeing the PowerPoint that whole time, right?
Well, no, I wasn't.
Oh, are you
Actually, I was
serious?
I was looking at the doc. I was looking at your Word doc in a separate window
Oh,
because I
son
could
of a gun.
manipulate it.
I had that up the whole time for the audience. Okay, I'm very upset right now. So,
Don't be
okay,
upset. You can just leave it in as a download. Uh, People will see it. It's fine. I
okay. So,
promise.
are you guys seeing the PowerPoint
We're
now?
we are we guys are seeing it now.
Okay, cool. So just very quickly, here are the first 7 premises that me and David just spent that whole time arguing for. I'm sorry, I thought you guys had the visuals. And now we're moving on to premise 8 here, but there's a table with the criteria. So that's what I'm going to be showing you in my Word document. Is that showing
Right.
up? Cool.
Let me. Yes. Yeah. That's and I've got that too. So yeah, just note that I'm not really looking at the presentation. I'm looking at the,
Your
the
notes.
the separate document. Um, because once again, I've got it blown up to blind man size.
Okay. But yeah, as long as you let me know so that the audience quickly just let me know if the audience is seeing this. Is it on the
If
screen?
I am the audience, they see it.
Cool. Okay, cool. So in the first place, philosophers have identified three main criteria. If you read the philosophers like Richard Swinburne or Gary Habermas, William Lane Craig, anybody who's written about miracles, they've come up with three main criteria, right? So number one, you have to obviously prove that the event happened or that whatever the object is, that it exists, whatever, right? Whatever miracle or religion authenticating event you're trying to prove, you have to prove that there is something to explain here. Next, you have to prove that the event is improbable to occur in some given random natural mechanisms or something like that. And then thirdly, you have to take, as Mike Licona puts it, the event takes place in a context charged with religious significance. So I've expanded on this work and gone into a lot more detail. So looking at the first one, I think that we follow, when we make intelligent design inferences, we follow specified complexity. So when we're looking at the improbability of a given event, we're trying to say, well, is this an extraordinary or complex event? And the religious context, that refers to the specification. The complex event adheres to a specified pattern. And I've developed certain criteria as to how we identify an event as complex or as an extraordinary event. Because when we think of miracles, I think that a reasonable real seeker, the average person, can identify events as signs and wonders. They know what's ordinary. And by that, I just mean the currently well-known or well-established natural laws of nature or natural mechanisms, which includes random chance. So if an event is deemed to be extraordinary, that demarcates it as a sign. It's a wonder. And even the dumbest, at least a reasonable person, which is the legal definition, an average person, intelligence, is that your cue for me to shut up? Average intelligence.
It's a cue that I should have hit my mute button.
No. So the average person, right? Average intelligence, average knowledge, average wisdom, discernment, stuff like that. They can at least tell the difference between a sign or an extraordinary event versus an ordinary event. And that's my criteria. So how would we tell that something is extraordinary? So in the first place, there are three, I'm going to skip this for a second. There are three main ways that I can tell. So the first way is a mechanistic argument. And this is the way you see most philosophers argue, right? They'll say, look, all of the currently well-known and or established ordinary natural mechanisms, at the very least, seem to the reasonable person to have been demonstrated to be improbable explanations. Or the event has been proven to be impossible, 0% kind of thing, because it violates or contravenes an established law of nature. So this is the mechanistic way, and this is the way you've heard most Christian apologists try to argue that an event is extraordinary. I have two other ways, though. This way is based on the event's uniqueness. So if an event is unique, but it's not alone enough for it to be unique by itself. No, it has to be unique despite there having been a sufficient opportunity for that event to have been duplicated within a naturalistic context, an ordinary natural context. So do you want me to give examples, David? I don't know how detailed I should get yet, but should I give examples?
Maybe when I have a chance to come back in, and I might ask for some examples. But
Okay.
Yeah, I think examples will probably be useful when I bring up my objection.
Cool. Okay, cool. So that keyword is the sufficient opportunity, uniqueness despite a sufficient opportunity for duplication in an ordinary natural context. The third way is based on not that the event itself is extraordinary, but the circumstances surrounding it. And this one's hard to think of examples, but basically circumstantial evidence like the timing, might signify that this is extraordinary in some way. Um, so yeah, I can give an example there. So that's how we prove an event is extraordinary. One of those three ways has to be established. But in addition, I also say that there's this uniqueness falsification criterion, right? So let's say we try to make a mechanistic argument whereby we argue that the event, all natural mechanisms that we know that are well established or ordinary natural mechanisms are improbable to a reasonable person. That alone isn't enough. The event has to be unique in terms of their occurring within a extraordinary context, that should say, rather than an ordinary context. So note that there's that twofold thing, right? So it's unique to extraordinary context, plus all well-known mechanisms are improbable to a reasonable person. Obviously, if you go through subcriterion A, where you argue it's unique, despite there having been sufficient opportunity, well, that just automatically entails that you've already fulfilled this falsification criterion. So it's a bit redundant on that front. But I just wanted to make that if you go the other two routes, circumstantial reasoning or the mechanistic argument, you also, I say, have to prove that the event is unique to extraordinary contexts as well. And that would go, yes, that's a sign. This is extraordinary. This is remarkable in some way. The next one is about specificity, right? So it's these extraordinary events are conforming to a independently established pattern. In this case, religion authenticating events, as we learned from my prior premises, are a way that we could expect God potentially to demarcate a religion as the one he wants us to follow. So yeah, this is an independent pattern. And how do we assess whether or not a given event is specified in this way? It does actually authenticate a religion. So in the first place, we have to prove that it's sufficiently attached to the religion. And David mentioned some objections when we went over premise A. How would we know if it's sufficiently attached to a religion? Is it, so I might make up, miracles done by a religious founder are sufficiently attached because religious founders are a special category of person versus randomly my atheist butcher down the street just performs an extraordinary event out of the blue for no reason. Well, that's not really attached to a religion or a religious message. Secondly, it's not enough that they're attached. This is where I think I go beyond Swinburne or Mike Licona. It can't just be attached, but it actually has to serve the purpose of authenticating that given religion that it's attached to. So you can have examples of that. I don't know, like, okay, the founder says maybe just says directly, look, I am doing this miracle to prove that Christianity is true or that this religion is true. Well, okay, obviously that serves to authenticate the religion versus other miracles where maybe we can't tell. I think Marian apparitions, even if you agree that there's something extraordinary to some of these cases, but is it actually serving to authenticate a religion? It's a little more iffy there. You'd have to do some work to establish that. And then finally, this is my unique idea, that event can't be subsumable to any other religion. And right, so sometimes there are extraordinary events like the virgin birth or Moses crossing the Red Sea, and multiple religions claim this event, right? Islam claims it, Christianity claims it. In the case of Moses, Judaism also claims it. The Baha'i faith, for crying out loud, I think they claim all miracles, if I remember properly. So yeah, the question of subsumability is, well, which religion gets this? And this is where I've come up with my sub-criteria of saying the first religion chronologically, I think that the reasonable real seeker will assume that the original religion gets it unless the later religion fulfills certain criteria for subsumability. Number one, the extraordinary event is not mutually exclusive or contradictory to the religion. So some people will argue, well, it can't, the resurrection can't go to Islam because the Quran explicitly contradicts this. We can get into that debate. I don't believe this, but still, this is an example. For example, this would be a way that we could rule out Islam from subsuming the resurrection of Jesus, for example. Secondly, the subsuming religion has to have its own independent, positive religion authenticating event of its own. And finally, the subsuming religion has to have an overall probability of more than 50% of being true or being the religion endorsed by God. So that's it for my table. I know that was a lot, but
Okay.
that's my case.
All right. So, I mean, I think all of these things make sense, but I'm not sure that making sense is sufficient for the ultimate premise that you're trying to drive home here. So I could give you a different set or a slightly modified set of requirements for a geauthenticating event, and that would make sense. And people could just judge, well, which one of your lists makes more sense, but neither would be authoritative in that way. We just both have lists that make sense, and you get to choose. But I do believe, there's a problem with just trying to come up with this list at all. So I'll just try to be.
Can I ask one quick question?
Sure.
Would you agree that a reasonable real seeker, and again, I haven't defined those terms, but reasonable, an average person kind of thing, they, at least many of them would, if an event fulfilled these criteria, they would believe that it's a religion authenticating event, at least, whether rightly or wrongly, they would come to that belief?
Maybe you should ask me that question later because I'm not entirely sure how to answer that.
No problem.
But it kind of brings me to my first and one of my main objections, and it's to one of the first things that you did as you were listing your criteria, which is the reasonable person. So let's set aside real seeker for a moment and just say the reasonable person.
Okay.
This is really hard to nail down because it feels like, it sounds like, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that you're making an assumption about culture and knowledge of the world at a particular place and time. So the reasonable Westerner who has an income of more than 20,000 a year might have, that average Westerner might have some similar notions about the world and the universe and nature and how it works. But that is not going to be true if you add in some person from, I just won't name a nation, but some, we'll say, developing nation who has no education and a culture that is not as advanced with information that we would consider modern and basic information where we are. Are you saying that person is not a reasonable person? Well, of course they're a reasonable person. They're just a person who doesn't have access to the same knowledge as we do. So if you go to biblical times, and let's go way back before Jesus, and let's just take the Bible story as if it were history, which it's not. And we go to.
You're totally wrong. My standard is for reasonable person is relative.
Okay, well, that's fine. I don't mind. I'm just trying to lay out this particular objection, and this is an example that will hopefully help lay that out. So if you go back to Moses and the Egyptians and the people who wrote the story, magic was a thing. It wasn't just a matter of tricks and illusions. It was a thing. It was a real thing. And so Moses is saying, I am a representative of God, and I have a G-authenticating event that I am going to show you. I am going to take this staff and I am going to toss it down, and it is going to turn into a snake. So Pharaoh sees that, and he's not impressed. He's seen it before. The story makes it seem like he's seen it before. In fact, he's seen it so often he can just call his magicians, because he's got magicians that do magic, and he says, "You can do that, right?" And they do it. They each have a staff. I think they have two staffs. Throw them down, they become snakes. So, notwithstanding the thing that happens next in the story, in this story, the thing that is supposed to be a geauthenticating event isn't. But in this story, you're talking about a storyteller that believes the universe is full of people who do real magic. So that's that kind of suggests that there may be a problem even getting started with your thesis. Now, you can always say, yeah, but God did another event where he caused his snake to eat the other people's snake. That's a neat trick, but that wouldn't have impressed Pharaoh. Pharaoh just would think, okay, that's a nice piece of magic. You thought of it before I did. Otherwise our snakes could have eaten your snakes. It's not that big of a deal, because for them, magic is all around. Oh, you can turn some water into blood. So can we. It's that sort of thing. And so maybe your God in this context is more powerful than our God for, in this event or other. But if we really wanted our God to show our stuff, maybe he could do some things that your God couldn't do. These were supposed to be G-authenticating events, and they weren't.
Can I
Go ahead?
Can I respond? Because this is such a great point, and it does show a misunderstanding on your part. So no, they were religion authenticating events, right? And just like the shroud may be religion authenticating event for me today, but maybe 20 years from now, no, it doesn't qualify. So there is an element of relativity here based on this reasonable person's culture, time, and knowledge base, right? And this is why I define ordinary natural mechanisms as being the currently well-known, well-established natural mechanisms within one's culture. Now, obviously, because of this relativity, that's going to be a bit of an issue. There is some element of, well, are we warranted in believing, not just justified? And obviously, that's where I'm going to get into where it's God's responsibility to prevent people, premise nine stuff. We'll get to that next. But I just want to affirm there is some relativity in the fulfillment of these criteria. So it does change. A religion authenticating event for someone in the year 1000 may not be as strenuous or the same. I don't know.
Well,
I don't
I
know.
think that you just have to clarify this relativity in your premise and your explanations of the premise, because what you said, at least what I heard you saying, is that it has to be, an I don't remember your exact wording, but an unusual,
Extraordinary.
event that doesn't seem to be, an ordinary natural event. And I'm just saying that what is ordinary and natural to one person is not to another. For a person who believes in ghosts, it's quite common. They might think, "Oh yeah, I heard this strange sound. It was the spirits speaking." G-authenticating event. We hear them tell that story, but we don't believe in ghosts, and we say, "No, you're wrong, and you're just not considering other possibilities."
Yeah,
And so,
I totally agree. I totally agree. Yeah,
yeah,
I need to work that in, but I do want to remember though there are criteria, so this wouldn't apply for anything. Like I can rule out Martin Luther thinking about lightning or a lightning storm, or them thinking it's Thor. There are a set of criteria whereby people in any time can outrule stuff, but still, your main point is, yeah, I need to be clearer about the relativity aspect for sure. So yeah.
Right. Well, this is part of my problem with the idea of even coming up with this normal event and reasonable person criteria, because even today in the Western world, with people who share largely the same culture and education background and so forth, you have, let's say, on the one end, charismatic Pentecostals who think very differently about the world and nature than, say, an Episcopalian who lives in the same town and goes to the church across the street. And so, for that charismatic person, miracles are happening left and right. They're being authenticated all the time. And for the Episcopalian, they look at the same events and say no. So I think it's very, very difficult to come up with the kinds of events you're talking about and then say all reasonable people would agree on this. You you
Well, yeah.
you haven't defined all reasonable people very well here.
Well, obviously, yeah, like we need to define what a reasonable person is. And there are people that don't behave like a reasonable person in this respect. So they don't really count. Um, yeah, if they come to false conclusions about some guy barking like a dog during a thing, and, just they find out, oh, yeah, I believe that was the Holy Spirit actually doing a miracle that was supernatural barking or something like, or extraordinary barking, then they're not, you could argue at least that they're not being a reasonable person in that
Well, but they
respect.
believe that way about glossolalia. Uh, and so you don't even have to go to barking and swinging from chandeliers. Glossolalia is we're talking about tongue speaking, is the kind of gibberish type tongue speaking. That's very common in the religious world. You even have that, I believe, among some Catholics. If I am wrong about that, I will get beaten about the
I,
head and shoulders with by Brian I. But that's
I,
fairly common.
by tongue speaking, are you talking about like the modern nonsense about tongues of
Yeah,
angels?
like that's why I say glossolalia. It's the kind of tongue speaking that sounds to anyone else like gibberish.
Okay,
The
well, here,
person the person that hears the gibberish is as reasonable a person as the person who thinks they're speaking in the tongues of angels.
so here's why I would argue they're not. Just with the first criterion, you see where my mouse is? It fails the
I
uniqueness
no.
criterion. Blah blah blah. I have just disproven that that is a religion authenticating event.
How do you
It's
know
like,
you didn't just speak in tongues, that God didn't loosen your tongue to say that?
because I know God would. I didn't feel the Holy Spirit saying it at all. So that it's just been duplicated in an ordinary naturalistic context. A reasonable person could not go tongue speaking in angelic tongues now in gibberish is anything special. It doesn't match my criteria. So
Yeah,
that's all.
okay. I just disagree with that. I've heard some very good tongue speakers. I mean, I wouldn't say that I'm mediocre, but I'm not the worst at it. I can produce some of it, but it's a real talent, dare I say, gift. Um, it's something that is cultivated over time, and I think there are very naturalistic explanations for it. But they wouldn't. They would say that it's God working through them, and it's evidence of God working through them. I'm not going to call that person unreasonable. Those people operate heavy equipment. They drive cars, they raise children, they run businesses, they are in Congress. So I'm not gonna say that person's a reasonable person, unreasonable person, simply because they have a conclusion that's different from mine, and yet you were just kind of disqualifying for them things that they would consider geauthenticating events in favor of your list of things. And that's why I said we can all come up with our list of things that we think would be good qualifications for, genuine miracles. And we just disagree. And we don't have any way to really settle that disagreement except to say the mildly ad hominem thing of, well, those people aren't reasonable.
Well, I think Okay, well, that's true, and I guess we would, if we're debating premise eight, I would need to establish, obviously, in premise eight, well, why are these criteria sufficient, right? And this is where you can just say, well, I don't like your criteria, but certainly reasonable people in general, I think, would agree that the average person would be able to see that with your example, just with the first criterion, they would say, yeah, this is a reasonable way to kind of say there's nothing extraordinary here. Dale just did this.
Okay, I would argue that the average person in Africa, I have no statistics on this, please do not call me a racist. The average person who lives in Africa, in certain parts of Africa, does not realize that the leg lengthening trick is a scam. They do not realize that. Hell,
Okay.
there's a large percentage of Americans who do not realize that. I'm not going to say that they're unreasonable simply because they do not know that they're being tricked. And so, once again, I just think it's a little bit ad hominem to say those people are unreasonable simply because they don't know as much as you do. And to get to your kind of general reasonability, you are putting barriers around the culture and geography and time frame.
I would say I'm not because I actually agree. I don't, again, I would need to know more about it, but from what I know, I might agree with you about the leg lengthening thing in cultures in Africa. That's different than the modern day tongues in the Western culture, which is what I was addressing. But yeah, again, we would need to go through this example and see if it fulfills these criteria for these people.
Yeah, I
As
mean, we could just go through YouTube and look at the various places in the world where crowds, hundreds, if not thousands of people are enthralled by someone doing a trick that is so simple, even I can do it. I learned how to do it as a kid. Not that hard, but it's a doable thing. And by the way, thousands of people gather in places where they see that and other tricks done right here in America. Probably filling the stadium right here in Jackson, where the local football team plays. You can fill that stadium up full of people who will be enthralled by that trick, thinking that God is doing a miracle. And you would have to say that all of those people are just unreasonable and therefore stand outside of your criteria of reasonableness.
Yeah, because people, obviously, there are people who are unreasonable all the time, right? We have to admit that. I get that it sounds harsh, I guess, but no, there are unreasonable people. Let's just be honest. There are some people that aren't acting reasonable. I mean, courts of law determine this all the time. So
I agree
I
with
would
that,
just
but I don't. I'm just my main objection here is that you haven't defined reasonable well enough to overcome this particular objection.
well,
Because
I think
I can name you a list of people who would see the world differently, and then you would have to say, okay, well they're unreasonable too. Well, they're unreasonable too, and
I
I would
think
say that to avoid that, you have to do a better job with reasonable, other than just stating what we commonly know, because that can only apply to what we commonly know here now.
Well, I think so. I think that again, it's what has this so-called reasonable person, with respect to the example of the leg lengthening or the levitating trick that they all do and stuff like that. These are real examples. If they truly are a reasonable person, okay, what have they done to demonstrate that this event is in fact unique to extraordinary contexts only? Have they done their best to research about that? You're just
No, they saw it. They saw it done by someone they trusted in a context where it didn't look like they could be fooled, and they didn't know um, that they could be fooled. They don't know how illusions work. They don't spend hours on YouTube looking up how is this thing done. It never crosses their mind to even ask the question. That doesn't mean they're unreasonable.
I think it is. If it didn't even cross their mind to ask the question and to, use whatever resources they had. It doesn't have to be going online or whatever. I mean, God,
I don't know how skeptical a person needs to be. Here I am talking as if
yeah,
I don't think people need to be skeptical. So this is what you've done to me. You've turned me into a bunch of blah 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 blah. Thanks, you and your tongues. But what I'm what I'm trying to say is they are reasonable. Their parents told them this is how the world works. Their preacher told them this is how the world works. Their teacher told them this is how the world works. And now here they are, live and in person. And lo and behold, that's how the world worked. So it's not fair to say that they have been unreasonable for thinking that they saw a thing that they didn't see.
again, you're just kind of, the issue here is that we're making assertions as to what, and they're somewhat plausible. Like I admit, yeah, they don't have the resources, especially if we're talking about back in time, that other places have and stuff like that. But they still have, this is why it should be reasonable real seeker, but it's also, they do have this duty to fulfill certain criteria to be this reasonable person. And I've kind of outlined what I think is the process that the average person would go through in coming up with saying, yeah, this event is an extraordinary event designed to authenticate a given
Right.
religion.
And I
And
think your process is too narrow, and I think it is too academic, and it's targeting only a certain kind of person, which I don't think the world is mostly populated by. And it certainly hasn't been mostly populated by that over time.
okay, and one thing I did want to say is, I, again, for my argument, because it's a minimal argument, I don't even have to necessarily assume that this is the only list. This is just one example of a list whereby someone, a reasonable person or reasonable real seeker, could be convinced, or many of them would be convinced that the event is a religion authenticating one. So there could be other lists that also would qualify as a reasonable person. I would need to see that.
Right, but
I don't.
that's what I'm saying. We have to just negotiate on what we think. There's no authoritative way to do this, I think. Let me just give you my one other objection that's worth mentioning here. And it'll
Do you
provide
do you
enough
understand
pushback.
my my point here? Because this is important as well. Is that
Yeah.
I'm not denying with this premise. I'm not necessarily saying this is the only list. There could be other lists that are also valid, whereby God would have to reveal the truth to any reasonable real seeker. I don't think the examples you've given in Africa qualify, but I'm just saying there. This is just one example of a list whereby me, for example, this is what I followed, and I'm a reasonable real seeker. Therefore, I'm justified in believing that the shroud or the resurrection is a religion authenticating event.
Okay. I forgot this and remembered it and forgot it several times. Let me just get this out of my mouth while I still remember it. Oh, there it goes. Forgot it. So
Right. Go
I
ahead.
it's it's kind of important. Give me a second. Let me see if I can um, get it out of. Oh yeah, it's that you have to prove that the event happened, or have reasonable proof that the event actually happened as a part of your criteria.
Mhm.
And I would argue that that almost torpedoes the whole of number 8, in my opinion, because we're talking about proving history in most cases, proving things that happened one time that cannot be repeated. You can't do it. So there's some, I guess, some, excuse me, ways of going about deciding whether you are going to believe something or not. But it's really hard to prove a thing that happened. And if it happened one time, and even if it's outlandish, and even if the chances of it happening by naturally are practically zero, we're talking about a miracle. And so the chances of whether it would happen naturally or not are almost irrelevant. So one example might be Joseph Smith and the magic hat. Was it Smith and the hat? Is that?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is this is the founding miracle for Mormonism.
Mhm.
How do you know it didn't happen? You don't know that it didn't happen if miracles can happen. All you can say is it's the most ridiculous thing you've ever heard of, but miracles are ridiculous. So,
Well,
in the world of ridiculous things that could happen that would prove an event, it's definitely one of them. But you can't say it didn't happen. And one of the ways that a Mormon would deal with this is by the whole burning in the bosom. You have to decide whether you believe it happened by the sign of the holy heartburn. And so there's no way for me to sit here from my position in the world and say that it did not happen. By the way, it did not happen. But I can't say that authoritatively, and neither can you. And it any more than you can prove that some of the things that you believe are geauthenticating events happened.
Misunderstanding maybe, because again, the whole point of this, we're not saying the event is necessarily a miracle. That's the point of the table. We're just saying
No, you're saying that it happened. That you the first criteria of the event is that it actually happened.
or whatever, right? Like if it's a past event, then yeah. But I mean, if it's a future event, we would have to prove that event will happen, or whatever is relevant to the specific religion authenticating event we have in mind. But it's not presupposing that the event itself, like I'm not presupposing that, like for me, the event with the resurrection, let's say, right, is okay. The disciples all had an appearance, what they thought was an appearance of the risen Jesus. That's the event, and then we go into the other criteria to go, well, is this an a miracle? Is this a religion authenticating miracle or not? We would have to go through that process, but the event itself is something that, okay, well, did they have this? Or with the Shroud of Turin, I'm not saying the event is that they were miraculously formed. I'm saying that no, the event is there are images that were formed on the shroud.
Okay, but I think that you're misunderstanding my objection.
Okay.
For instance, I'm just going to grant something that I don't actually grant, but that the disciples all had this visionary experience of Jesus. I don't even think all of the disciples existed. So I think the 12 is kind of a fake number. You probably have Peter, John, James, maybe one other or two others. But first of all, I don't consider the Book of Acts authoritative for anything. And so if you're asking me, did all the disciples, especially these 500 people that Paul fabricated, have the event of seeing the religious Jesus? I'm going to say no. But if being generous here, let's just assume that Peter had is accurately described as believing that he saw the risen Jesus. Okay. And that's the event, right? So you would have to say, well, that event would have had to happen. And you think that you have reason enough to believe that Peter thought he saw the risen Jesus, right? So I understand that's what you're saying. Now understand my counter to that. I think it is absolutely historical that Joseph Smith says that he had this event. Mm-hmm. That is historical. That is more historical than Peter saying that he saw the risen Jesus, in my opinion. But let's just say they're equally historical. Those are historical things. Whether the miracle suggested in those things actually happened is not even something that we're judging right now. We have two equally historical events that launched religions. And it becomes a matter of a person's investigatory abilities to see which, if either or both of those things actually happened.
Yeah, I think I. So
And a reasonable person could come to believe that both or neither or one of those things actually happened.
so I think so in terms of the criteria. Again, it doesn't matter whether the specific examples that you've raised, in fact, happened historically or not, right? But for the purposes in premise 8, it's if you're going to claim this thing is a religion authenticating event. Let's take the Book of the Mormon thing, right? And seeing the golden plates allegedly. I don't think that's historical, but I do think that
But it's historical that it was claimed.
it's historical that it claimed later.
Well, that's all the history we've got for the disciples too.
Again, it's not about that. Pretend that evidence is piss poor for both cases, right?
Or
If
just as strong for both cases. I'm not trying to say the evidence is bad for either. But to eliminate the Mormons in Joseph Smith, and that is a geauthenticating event, you'd have to be putting that into a separate category, I think. And I don't see your justification for doing that.
See, I don't, right? It's the exact same thing. If I'm assessing the disciples, okay, what is the historical evidence that this event happened, that Peter thought he saw the risen Jesus, whatever or that the tomb was empty, whatever fact you're using, you would apply historical criteria that's appropriate for that time and place, and come up with, okay, I'm 60% convinced that this actually happened. Same with with Mormons and the hat and the golden plates. Did they actually see this stuff? You would evaluate all of the evidence relevant to that fact, and you'd make a judgment that, yeah, I guess it's historical. They were seeing it. Now, how do we explain it? That's where we go to criterion B. Is it extraordinary? And criterion C, does it take place in a religious authenticating context or not? If it passes it, then you could say, yeah, I guess if you're saying for the sake of argument, the Mormons fulfill all the criteria, then I guess the golden plates prove Mormonism is true. But it's just in reality, I think it utterly fails.
Right. We just both have different opinions of that. I think they both fail. But if I'm being the same kind of generous to both, then they both succeed. And you have no way of differentiating the two except to declare, yeah, but mine really happened and yours didn't, and I'm right and you're wrong. And if it's about geauthenticating events, you can use, in fact, some of the same logic that Christians use to fulfill theirs. Like, for instance, the amount of sacrifice that Mormons were willing to go through in the early days for Mormonism to happen. Look at the thousands of Mormons who died, in various persecutions and in the harshness of the land that they went to, but they stayed the course. What could possibly explain that unless they knew it was true? You see, it's the same kind of thing. We could do that for some other religions too. And so I don't think that there's anything particularly special about the geauthenticating event of the resurrection that says, oh, well, this is the only event that happens that fits your criteria that validates religion over other events that validate religions, because those religions also exist and have millions of followers.
Yeah. So in this case, you're saying the event is, look, despite persecution, I'm just taking it for granted that they're the same. For the sake of argument here, let's pretend they are the same, right? Early Mormons went through the same type of persecution that the early Christians went through, and yet they persisted. That's the event, and we can prove that happened historically, at least given your example. I'm taking your assumptions because I do think there is a difference, but let's say it's the same. Great, that's the event. Now we've proven that happened, but is it a religion authenticating event? That's where we have to go. Okay, well, people enduring through having enduring beliefs through persecution. Number one, is that unique to paranormal content? No, that I can think of ordinary natural examples where people.
Okay, great. If that's not unique, then Christians ought to stop using it as an argument.
I agree. They should.
Well, we should just stop there. There's the sound bite that's. anything that I say from here is just going to take away from that. Just stop the tape.
But I should clarify for the Christians before they think, hey,
No clarification. Where is that stop button?
I'm saying that in and of itself does not prove that the resurrection belief is true in any way.
Sure.
But it can be, that element can be used in a compound argument, maybe. Again, I would more use it that they decide the early eyewitnesses, those are the ones that matter to me. I don't care about Jim Bob Jones enduring persecution. He wasn't in a position to know. Same with me. If I'm willing to be martyred for my faith, proves nothing about the truth of whether Jesus rose from the dead. It just proves I believed it because I'm not an eyewitness or something. So like, yeah, there's qualification out there for the Christians, but the straightforward argument of, well, look at all the Christians who just endured through persecution as despite being random people, garbage argument. Stop using it, Christians, please.
Look, okay. I'm going to say you have defeated me by agreeing with me, and that's not what I was going for at all. So I'm very dissatisfied with this section.
But you see how the criteria work, right? Just right here with the first one, it's already gone.
Well, but my broader point is you can go down the line of the criteria, and you can. I think that I could just as successfully come up with those same kinds of authenticating events for other religions that one would have to ultimately take on faith that the miracle actually happened, and you can kind of go through the criteria and determine whether you think that miracle is historical or not. And I think that many people have done that, which is why there are many gods that are still around and many religions that are still around, and why people prefer their religions and not Christianity, say, because they've heard Christianity being presented. Boy, have they heard it, but they're not convinced by it because their story is more convincing and their history is more convincing. And so I don't think that your criteria comes up with a way to differentiate or preference Christianity over any other. And therefore,
that's right. Yeah,
if that's true, then it's not really an authenticating event.
Well, so that's why we get to premise 11. That's where I privilege Christianity. Right now, I'm just saying, how do we adjudicate? I don't know. Maybe Islam or Hinduism is the one that has a religion authenticating event, and Christianity's false. How are we going to tell? This is how we're going to assess all the religious events that are claimed to be extraordinary or whatever. We're to authenticate that religion. We'll put it through this as a filter. But one thing I just wanted to ask you, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but I am curious because you mentioned that there could be other lists. And I've spent 8 years really looking at what everyone's said about that, how people assess religions, both scholarly and also on a layman level as well, like and stuff. As an average person, if without just, I take it you're not just, well, I have the same list, but minus one criterion. Like what would be a list of a completely different set or list of criteria that you think would be rationally justified or reasonable for people to go, yep, God did this and he's proving this Christianity is true. If it's not my criteria, what would you use?
Okay. I will just disappoint skeptics everywhere. Back in the first season of SNS, we did this thing where we kind of swapped sides a little bit and talked about the worst arguments and the best arguments from both sides. And the thing that I said was that the best argument for Christianity is the internal arguments. It is, in fact, the sensus divinitatis, even though I have slayed that argument mercilessly, and I'm not sorry for it. wish I had slayed it even harder, but understand what I'm saying. That's the best argument for the religionist, not just the Christian, because it's something that cannot be interrogated externally. So if the best argument for me personally for Christianity would be if God spoke to me the same way he spoke to Paul, if he interceded in my life in that same way. Also, if he gave me the power to raise dead people, that would greatly help. But whether Paul was delusional because he fell off his horse and hit his head, or whether God really spoke to him, for Paul, there's no difference. God spoke to him, right? He's 100% convinced, and then he can tell his story and convince other people. But he can only do that because he is convinced. Right? I'm giving Paul the benefit of the doubt here. Right? So that's what Christianity is based on. Christianity is based on story and testimony. It's not based on this evidential thing. That's another show to be discussed, but that's not how Christianity spread. Christianity didn't spread because they had evidence of the risen Jesus. Christianity spread by story and testimony and sales and the yearning for those things to be true. So I honestly think that the strongest evidence of a miracle, of a G authenticating belief, would be the internal kind where God has showed you this. And you can just babble on about it. It doesn't matter to other people if you're mad or not. You know because you know because you know. Now, what would make that more strong and convincing to other people is if everybody had that experience of God. And this is where the sensus divinitatis thing really fails for me. If one person has it, then God has convinced one person. If everybody has it, God has convinced everybody. And so I think it's a failure of God that he does not communicate to more people that way. And I'm sorry, I don't consider it a failure of me because I don't believe Paul or Peter in their encounter. They had an encounter. Good for them. I didn't. Right? So I do think it would be a G authenticating event if you do have that encounter, but it would be way more convincing if everybody did.
So that's okay. So that's interesting then, because and that is, I do remember that show. So you are being consistent that the properly basic belief, which is technically it's a different mechanism than these religion authenticating events or G belief authenticating events, which are meant mostly to look at objective evidences or from miracles or whatever. But just so I'm understanding you, so I get that you think the PBBs are the best route, and I think you're right, and I think that is how most Christians come to a warranted true belief.
It's also how Mormons do it. I mean, it is just another way of saying the fire in the belly. I mean, I know you differentiate from that a little bit, but just be a little bit charitable there. It is the same thing for them. It is why they believe the miracle claims, because they have an internal conviction sense that seems to come outside of themselves that it is true.
Okay, so let's put that to the side because that's not the topic for today. What I want to know from you then, are you saying that that's the only way? Like a reasonable person couldn't use like a list of criteria to rationally infer that there's a religion authenticating miracle?
No, I just don't think that it's the best way. And so if we're, I mean, you asked me to, give you another list or another type of thing that would produce a G authenticating event, and I presented that I could do other things, and I could come up with more elaborate lists. I just happen to think that that's the superior one, and so I would take my internal knowledge that it is true because God spoke to me over all of the evidence that you could present. Because the evidence that you can present is largely given to us, passed down to us by history from people who had experiences like the one I'm describing. And so we're evaluating stories of other people's experience. And I'm saying, you know what's superior than that? Actually having the experience.
Fair enough. Okay. All right, cool. So I think I'll let it go, and we'll move on because we've got three premises left, kind of thing.
Yeah, but you know
Unless,
what? I bet there's so much similarity here. I bet we've covered most of that ground, but let's find out.
okay, cool. So premise nine, this is where God's responsibility comes in, right? So this is why I can convert just a reasonable person or a reasonable real seeker's mere rational justification. Remember, that's relativized based on these criteria, and it converts to actual warrant. I can actually know that Christianity is true or God endorsed Christianity despite only having mere justification with the criteria, because God, as a real maximum grade being, he can't allow any undue confusion, which is any confusion that would unjustifiably hinder me from achieving my goal one, from achieving. So I've phrased it differently, but positively here. So if God allowed an event as described in premise eight to occur in relation to a religion, and that religion does not facilitate the achievement of goal one, and there are no further clarifying mechanisms attached, then this would entail that many reasonable real seekers would unjustifiably, that should say, fail to achieve Go 1. And this is inconsistent with God's own essential nature. God can't allow for undue confusion. So therefore, I can rest assured if there is an event that supports Christianity or Islam or whatever, and it fulfills these criteria, yep, I know that that religion is what God, at least for the right now, that's what God wants me to follow.
Right. God can eliminate undue confusion by just giving everyone the same authenticating internal knowledge of it being true. It only becomes confusing when you have these one-time events that happen to one person or, a room full of people in some faraway place, in some faraway time that cannot be repeated, and all you have are stories from these people about these things. That's how the confusion happens. But if everybody had the event, I'm at risk of repeating myself, there wouldn't be any confusion. So if what God really wanted to do was eliminate confusion, there are easier and more certain ways for him to do it. And so I'm not entirely sure that God would want to eliminate confusion. And if you'll allow, I am confused by some of the conversations that we've had. I don't think God does want to eliminate the confusion for everybody, because it would be somehow an upset to his plan if every person who was ever born was saved. So to get this kind of end goal of the maximal number of the right kind of person fulfilling their ultimate goal, then some people won't. I remember asking about this. I don't know if it was on air or not. So if it's not, you can edit this out. I don't mean to. I just don't remember what all conversations we had in private or not. But if God doesn't seem to want everybody to be saved. He has this end goal, and with his middle knowledge, he knows the maximum number that would be saved. And so if I am, for instance, through his knowledge of what I would choose and so forth, if I'm one of those people who he knows won't be saved, then by the same token, in logic, I am a person he doesn't want to understand. He wants me to be confused because that will, in fact, facilitate his ultimate end. So I don't know that you have shown that this clarifying mechanism would be a thing for all humans. I mean, I guess you could say for some humans, for the humans that he wants it for. But the way it's worded, it makes it sound like this is something that all humans could attain, when we know that that would go against God's ultimate plan.
All right, fair enough. Yeah, it's okay. Again, we've been going for like 2 hours 45 minutes, I think, right?
I
You
don't
know
know.
the because I can't see anything in the time. Okay, so yeah, I'll just give this one counter kind of thing is that again there is confusion, and there is a sense in which God wants everybody to be saved. This is a more of Christian theological thing, but so it's not necessarily the case in terms of this premise. But yeah, just to explain, yes, God wants everyone to be saved, but in light of Go One, he knows that that's just impossible. So he has to make do with the best universe he can, where as many people as possible do achieve Go One, and that's why he creates this universe. Um, and I do think that, yeah, so God is willing to allow certain types of confusion. So, for example, if you're not a reasonable real seeker, yeah, God is perfectly allowed to give confusion and allow for confusion. Certainly, I'm not the best communicator and stuff, and David admitted that sometimes when we're just talking, God has allowed me to exist and to confuse David with some of the philosophical mumbo jumbo that I've said. Right? There's no problem with that. It's just this premise is trying to say, but he can't allow for undue confusion, and that's confusion that would this should say unjustifiably uh, hinder all reasonable real seekers from achieving Go One or their ultimate purpose.
Sure. I will just interrupt you and say I agree with that as stated in its very narrow form. But so correct me if I'm wrong. Tell me if this is something that you believe or don't believe. If perhaps, let's word it this way. If I am saved and that means that 10,000 people would be lost, does it make sense that God would not want me to be saved?
Yeah, and you guys are the only. It's only you. There's 10,001 people in the entire universe. Just for the sake of argument, then yes, God.
It's better for me to be lost in 10,000 to be saved than for me to be saved and 10,000 to be lost, right?
Exactly. It
Okay.
is a numbers
So
game.
in that scenario, God would want me to have, uh, let's remove the word undue, justifiable confusion.
Would want you to have justifiable. I don't think he would want you to have justifiable.
Well, it's justified why he wants me to be confused. Because if I'm not confused and I repent and turn to him, 10,000 will be lost.
Well, it's so you are ultimately responsible, or every human being is going to be responsible for their confusion, but it is justifiable from God's perspective to create this universe in which he knows you're not going to be a reasonable real seeker and come to faith, and because of that 10,000 people will be saved, whereas
Right.
otherwise
But he could intervene and grant me that salvation, but that would somehow, in the cosmic balance of things, cause the 10,000 to be lost. So he is, in fact, also actively choosing not to save me.
yes, when he chooses to what world to actualize this world, that is him being sovereign and making that choice. He's actualizing the circumstances that you are making your free choice to not be a reasonable real seeker with.
Right. So this is the nature of the objection that I have here, and this just may be a wording thing, or as you've put the premise. I would just say that this God hypothetically could demonstrate to those elect people events and things that would authenticate the truth of Christianity, but he does not necessarily do that for every person on earth. Because if every person on earth understood perfectly that God was indeed authenticated and Christianity was authenticated, it would blow his plan. So you can't. This premise can't be right.
Well, I don't see,
Or at least it can't be universalized the way it sounds like you're you're
But you're asking me a question as to what I believe is a Christian. I'm struggling to see, like, this premise doesn't presuppose my theological beliefs. So I don't know. Maybe I'm misunderstanding how it's a refutation.
okay. So maybe I am not understanding the premise. That is, among all things, possible. But I mean, you were talking about God not allowing undue confusion and things like that. But
Oh,
God does allow. Once again, I take it. I think that you should probably take out undue, because that word is a little bit fraught. But God, under your theology, does allow confusion, and under the theology that I had, that some people would be given over to strong delusions so that they would believe a lie. That's a person that God's not trying to unconfuse.
yeah. I guess just to kind of clarify, like, the difference, like, you are definitely confused, I would say. Again, speaking as well, I don't have to speak as a Christian, but, like, anyways, you are confused as an atheist or something, and it's a question. I would deny that you are unduly confused. I don't think God can allow that in any form. And premise nine is just focused on reasonable real seekers, and saying if they went through the process of going through that table I did, and they found an event like I did with the shroud, God couldn't, because God can't allow any undue confusion. That means I can't be confused about this event, saying, yeah, God wants me to follow this religion. So that,
At a practical level, though, how does your real seeker differ from the Calvinists' elect? Because God, the elect are going to hear God's voice. My sheep hear my voice. So for you, the real seeker sees the authenticating events and are not confused. How are those functionally different?
because basically at the end of the line, the real seeker, there are three requirements that we covered in our previous show on what it means to be a real seeker. And it's up to each individual person and their libertarian free will to choose to fulfill those elements or not. And to the degree that they do fulfill them, this allows the Holy Spirit to, or whatever, God, this will make God able to not have you be confused about stuff.
Okay, but it seems like it's just another way of saying only the elect are real seekers, or all real seekers are the elect, and they will see the authenticating events clearly as they should without confusion. And everyone else who's confused is not the elect, and were not real seekers, and therefore are left to their own confusion. I mean, it's just different ways of getting to the same end. It seems to me.
Yeah, I think you describe it properly. I agree with you with one qualification, and that hasn't come up in my argument here. But so when I say God can't allow any undue confusion to any reasonable real seeker, or the elect as you call them, that's true, but it's up after the point of no return, because I think that I was a reasonable real seeker for a time, yet I was still confused about the religion. But that didn't qualify as undue confusion, because God only responsible to reveal the truth at or before the point at which we will unjustifiably not be able to achieve our ultimate purpose. So there could be reasonable real seekers out there. Maybe you are one. I don't know. You deny it specifically, so I have to say I know for you, you are not a reasonable real seeker.
I'm
But
not now, but I used to
not
be.
now.
So no, I'm with you there. So
Fair enough. Well, if you had maintained that status, maybe 20 years from now, God would have revealed to you before you died that what the truth was, and you would have, oh my gosh, Dale was right about the shroud the whole time, or Mike, man, Gary Habermas is a genius. The
right,
resurrection.
but I've simply fulfilled his preordained plan that I would not be a part of his elect. And so his universe plays out the way he always intended it to be.
Yeah, but you are choosing to go along with that. So
Yeah, I mean, I find throwing in free will to be it doesn't help the argument. I mean, whether you say it's libertarian free will, but it's Molinism, or you say it's not libertarian free will and it was God's plan from the beginning, it's practically speaking, it works out to be the same. So, the inner mechanism of that, of how you get there, is just a matter of what religious and philosophical tradition you prefer. But you're both, you and the Catholic, the Calvinist arrives at the same place ultimately.
gotcha. Okay, cool. Yeah,
We
the
can
last
skip 10.
we can skip
I
10
think you
hours.
were right about skipping 10. Let's jump straight to 11.
Okay, cool. So yeah, this is basically saying, well, guess what? As a matter of fact, Christianity does have events that fulfill the criteria of premise 8 for being a religion authenticating event. And I've said that in my coming to faith, I think there are 4 religion authenticating events, possibly a 5th one. But there was 4 that played a role in my conversion. Sorry, 3. The historical evidence for the resurrection, formation of the Shroud of Turin, and the vindication argument. The other was the properly basic belief that David mentioned, but that's outside of the religion authenticating events as this argument is looking at them. Yeah, I mean, it's straightforward. This is just a factual premise, and I would need to, like I said, I've written 300 pages establishing the shroud. At some point in the future, I'm going to write my case, my argument for the historical evidence for the resurrection, and I'll also be writing up a case for the vindication argument. But yeah,
Yeah, and this is the shortest one we will do, because I will simply say, so I'm I'm pretty much done with that argument. Look, we don't need to go rounds on the shroud. Dell has written many trees worth of shroud, and he's recorded reels and reels of tape on the shroud. You can talk about it there. I have talked a little bit about why I'm unconvinced. I am never going to be convinced by the shroud. Sorry. So no need to discuss that one. The vindication, you're going to have to talk about that a little bit. I think that you'd be on firmer ground to talk about the Sensus Divinitatis, frankly, but that maybe that's something that you could go over. But as far as the resurrection, I would just say inherently, by its very nature, is something that cannot be historically proven. So it is something that you can collect some evidence on, and you can weigh that evidence, and you can decide whether you believe it or not, or you can just actually believe it or not, because I don't think it's a matter of decision. We either believe it or we don't. I am as familiar with all of the evidence for the resurrection, Dale, as you are. I am not convinced by it. I don't believe it. I can't make myself believe it. I can't pretend to believe it. I just don't believe it. You are aware of the evidence and you believe it. So that's great. That's more of a PBB argument to me than a historical evidence of the resurrection argument. There can be no historical evidence of the resurrection. There can only be a collection of things that you consider and you have a feeling about one way or the other. You've done some mathematical probability, and that's how it lands for you. It lands differently for me.
okay, all right. Well, yeah, I'll just sum up by taking a page out of David's book and saying everything he just said. Nuh-uh.
Look, it's a very powerful argument when used correctly.
There you go. Yeah, exactly. I find it works best that way. That's what I have a debate with Jordan from Reason to Doubt on Friday, where we're just going to be debating premise 8 in my argument. How do we identify miracles? And everything, my response to everything he says is just going to be nah, and leave it at that.
Which would probably be the best answer. Honestly, so.
Awesome. Well, now that we're at the end, let me ask you, David, because I was really excited about the show. I know I was a little bit rude as a host. Sometimes I was interrupting you. That was just exciting.
It's just a conversation. This sounds, look, for anyone who's wondering, this sounds like the kind of conversation that Dale and I have when we're not recording. So it's just a conversation. That's just what it is.
No, but this was great. Like this was, I think, one of, if not my favorite show of all time, because this is the most important thing. My 11 premise argument, how I came to faith, and there are a couple things that I need to fix up that I learned from talking to you. So this has been an absolute pleasure for me.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and I feel like I understand where you're coming from, your center is, and I think that when you're talking to someone, it's useful to know their founding story, their thesis around which everything else revolves. I mean, some people, philosophers, might say, that's your worldview, and if you understand a person's worldview, then you can understand where they're coming from. I don't personally have one, but that said, I think this is helpful for people to know where your center is and to understand where your theological insight comes from. This is the center where everything else comes from theologically from you.
let me ask you then, because I remember in the past, before we've gone over this stuff, you guys have said stuff about that where it was on the boards the other day. Mac Attack, for crying out loud. He just makes up stuff that I'm. Dale's 11 premise argument is just subjective opinion. Like what? This is an objective, deductive argument. It is objective, right? It's meant to be. Obviously, it's written in standard form, so you don't get all of my hundreds of pages of reasoning behind the premises, but these are explicitly objective. And hopefully this show has given at least some kind of indication that there is stuff to warrant the premises. I'm not just asserting, oh, God exists, or basing it on, in the past, Darren has mentioned that my 11 premise argument presupposes Christianity, and it doesn't at all. So I don't know, is that helped?
I don't think the 11 premise argument presupposes Christianity. I do believe it presupposes a certain kind of God.
Yeah.
I think it is necessary for the kind of God that you suppose to be true before you can get to premise 2. So if that God doesn't exist, there's no, you don't have any premises. So
forget though, just to quickly, that's not a presupposition on my part. I'm arguing for that premise, just like I am all the others.
right. Well, I don't mean to crassly call it a presupposition. I know that for you have arguments and proofs to justify that. All right. So it's. I'm not suggesting that, and I think it's somewhat rich for a Calvinist to call someone else a presuppositionalist. Anyway, but that said, that premise has to be proven to someone sufficiently before the other 10 premises come into play. So I think that's what I mean when I say it presupposes or it's presuppositional. It's foundational, maybe a better word. It is bedrock. It's the place where there's nothing underneath and where that everything rests on. So it is, the existence of this God is your philosophical and theological bedrock. That's a little bit different than calling it a presupposition.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, I fully agree. Obviously, I wrote this argument in standard form, and that's just every argument, any argument in the entire world. You have to lay out your reasoning as to why you accept the premises and stuff. Right. So I get what you guys are saying.
These premises are not your proofs for God existing. They are the thing you do after you've proved that God existed. And perhaps, there's a magnus opus that you might write laying out your proofs for God's existence. And that would be a good place to start. But the 11 premise argument assumes that you've already made that case. God existing being your foundational, your bedrock, then this is what follows. And I think that's how people should understand that. So I don't think that people should try to dismiss it because you haven't proven premise 1. For you, the conversation has advanced beyond premise 1, and this is what follows because that is true, and then you might have to go back and prove it to someone, but that's for yourself. You've already proven it. You haven't simply presupposed it. So I'm trying to say this for the skeptics who are listening to this to kind of understand the fine distinction that Dale is making, and I think it's proper that Dale make this distinction.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you for saying that, because that's exactly right. And it's not just premise one. It's not like premise two is necessarily entailed by premise one, or premise three is you have to establish or give your reasoning for every single premise, starting with premise one, because that is a foundational one. But yeah, every single premise. That's why I'm going to be writing up tens of thousands of pages for my book, kind of thing, right? With premise one, I have written the cosmological argument, which is 200 pages. That's just one argument for premise one. That I've got other arguments that I've got to get into.
Dale, it's not a book; it's a library. You're trying to write a library.
Pretty much, yeah. That's my goal. That's what Real Seeker's mission statement is. I want to get that done, and here's everything. Here's why I'm a Christian. This is everything. Go and assess it. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Look, this is how we assess arguments. Number one, is it valid? And then number two, okay, are each of the premises sound or deductively strong? What are your reasons for thinking God exists? What are your reasons for thinking that if God exists, there are God outcomes? And that's where you get into it. And that's not on my website, because that I did all that work during my religious research, and I'm just putting up the premises in standard form. And now I'm working on showing others, well, how did I arrive at these premises? And that's where I'm doing my shows and write-ups and stuff.
I think your premises, whereas I hope that skeptics look at that and listen to that so that they can have better interaction with you, so they can at least understand where you're coming from and debate the things that you actually mean versus, unintentionally strawmanning your meaning. There's plenty to debate about your views once they understand your views. But I honestly think that this 11 premise argument is better targeted toward Christians because you don't have to explain premise one to them. It's someone who already shares largely your idea of the God that is necessary in premise one. And so I think that you will find that MacAttack is not the only Christian who would either fail to understand or otherwise fail to agree with your position. And those, I think you've got a very fertile audience for that, and this might be a foundation for your evidentialist approach. As a Christian, I wasn't an evidentialist, and I always thought that was one of the most dangerous paths to go down, but that's a discussion for another day. But for Christians, there's I think that's your argument. I mean, that's your audience, and you should be focusing this on them, because you don't have to explain all these premises to them. You don't have to found all of these premises quite as much. You're not going to get the same pushback, and you can actually have the real discussion that you're trying to have, and showing why evidentialism is true and why you need to be a real seeker and that sort of thing. I really think that's a very good in-house debate to have, and if it's correct, then you should kind of consider other Christians your primary audience.
So, okay, interesting take. So that you're kind of siding with MacAttack. Obviously, I would just say, like, I disagree. This is for anyone who's a rational thinker. This argument, especially if you're an unbeliever, it should speak to you even more, because I'm answering the question, why am I a Christian? And this is a deductive argument. Arguments are objective evidence. So, you can interact with my reasoning. Again, I haven't provided that in my standard form. I mean, standard form is just presenting statements or assertions. Their statements are either true or false, kind of thing. And then you have to provide your reasoning for it. And that's what I plan to do on Real Seekers.
Right.
You'll,
I understand that, and look, I more power to you. I I've talked to tens of thousands of Christians over the course of my life. Uncountable, tons of conversations, and I honestly believe that if you ask Christians why you're a Christian, why you remain a Christian, why'd you become a Christian, why do you remain a Christian, they would not have most of the answers that you do.
that's
They have a very different kind of Christianity than you do, and I think that they would find your thesis to be interesting and challenging, and some will like it and find that it's good. Some will debate it and find that they very much disagree with you. But I mean, that's where the opportunity for growth is, in my opinion. If you think that Christians are Christians for bad reasons and don't really fully embrace their story and don't really fully understand the reasons they're losing to atheists online is because they don't have a good foundation for their own Christianity and so forth. I think that's a strong place to be, and you could stake your academic career on that. I just think you're missing the bigger audience for your work. But by all means, I think that there's a good audience on Skeptics and Seekers, not just the usual suspects who comment, but the people who download and listen to the show every week. There's an audience for them, but yours, you'd be a best-selling book writer right now if you were just targeting a slightly different audience.
Gotcha.
So,
Fair enough. Fair enough. Cool. All right. Awesome. Well, yeah, I think that covers everything that I wanted to go over. I'm happy with the show. Any final comments from you before we wrap up? Or
no, I love this, and I hope that we can come back and revisit the I don't know what to call it, the theology by calculus
okay.
idea of figuring out the the probabilities. How you go through that, what that practically looks like. How you put that together and come up with a belief versus non-belief. I also think this is something that many Christians find novel, although you're not the first person to try to apply Bayes to this. But I think this is a very novel concept for both Christians and atheists, and I would like another shot at talking to you about that.
Yeah. Yeah. Because well, that's a great point. I didn't even think to bring that stuff up, but that fits into, like, okay, like premise one. There's those evidence arguments for God's existence. There's arguments against. How do I put that together to go, yeah, God probably does exist? That's where I use Bayes' theorem. And so, yeah, I would love to talk to you. I can give you examples with made up numbers.
Just lost you there.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, got you now. You
Oh,
said with made up
with made up numbers, just to illustrate how it might work and stuff like that. And the thing about me, again, with my technique, remember, it's a Bayes-ish technique, right? I'm not using Bayes' theorem proper, and that's, I think, a strength of my method. It speaks to the reasonable person. The average person can assign their own subjective probabilities to the different factors and plug it in this formula, and it's a quick little, I mean, everyone knows how to multiply and divide. That's all you need to know.
Let's
Uh,
let's see if we can come back next month. If not next month, the month after that, and
September.
plan to
Yeah,
talk about that.
I'm taking August off from all podcasts. I'm not doing a single thing.
A
So
wise move.
oh, I need it. I ever since Skeptics and Seekers, I've never had a vacation except for that summer where we took off in Skeptics and Seekers. But I've
Oh,
been
come on,
working.
be for real. Podcast is your vacation. Sometimes we just need vacations from our vacations.
There we go. I enjoy it. I love doing it, but I just need a
Yeah, I
break.
mean, you and I mean, we talk about taking a break from time to time. this is what I do to take a break from my life. This is my break. When I was writing for a living, people would often ask me, "Well, what do you do for fun?" And I would say, "I write." I, when I'm not writing for work, I write for fun. That's what I do. This is my vacation. But you need a break from everything that you do, that you love and enjoy, and maybe overserve from time to time. But heck, you and I, we don't make a dime off of this crap. We do it because we love it.
Exactly. Yeah. I've never asked for money. I never asked for likes or subscribers. It's up to the audience. If you want like what I have and you want to be informed, that's up to you. That's great.
To be clear, if no one pays me, I'm doing it anyway.
Same here. Exactly. That's helping. Well, for me, I have my motivations, right? I want to get that info out there and hopefully save some souls and stuff like that. So,
and my mind is just broken in such a way that this is what makes it feel good.
awesome. All right, cool. Well, yeah. So thank you so much for this, David, and we'll definitely do a show on the probabilities maybe sometime in mid September. And other than that, have a great week, everybody.
All right. Bye bye.